Chapter 105. Yuan Hongdao frowned. The Prime Minister said softly, "I've been in court for too long, and I don't know how many people I've offended. I have 2 sons and a daughter, and I had hoped that Gong would be successful. Who would have thought that he would suffer such a calamity? Now I only have De Bao and Qin. I have to make some arrangements for them." Yuan Hongdao frowned again. But this change seems to be a little too drastic. Lin Ruofu's gaze suddenly softened. As a father, there's no need to be so protective of your body. If we're talking about a fight for the throne, His Majesty is in the prime of his life. I'm afraid you and I will be long dead by then. There's no need to worry so much. He then asked, "Are you sure it was Sigujien who did it?" Yuan Hongdao nodded. "Yes." Lin Ruofu took a deep breath. "Sometimes I find that the power in my hands can't be exchanged for anything. But since the Fan family and the Overwatch Council have been secretly working together for so many years, I think that if I were to be included, they wouldn't refuse." Yuan Hongdao smiled. Assistant Minister Fan, relying on his friendship with His Majesty, pushed for this marriage. "Presumably you've been hoping for it for a long time." Lin Ruofu smiled. "In a few days I want to see that Fan Xian with my own eyes. I want to see if he's worthy of my daughter." Yuan Hongdao then said, "What about the eldest princess?" He knew that the Prime Minister's second son's unnatural death was inextricably linked to the eldest princess's plan, so Yuan Hongdao very carefully mentioned her name. Li Yunrui had Wu Bo, and prepare for the first assassination. It was a plan that killed 3 birds with 1 stone. By killing Fan Xian, she could regain control of the palace treasury. By persuading Gong, she could use this as a rope to bind the Prime Minister's manor tightly to her. But she didn't expect that Fan Xian wouldn't be so easy to kill, and that bastard Wu Bo and then my son died. Lin Ruofu's eyes flashed coldly. But she still has the most important part. She calculated His Majesty's intentions. Even if Cheng Jushu and his party could escape the capital, I'm afraid that she would have faked my orders and had Fang Xiu killed in Sangzhou, to prove that Northern Qi committed the murder. Yuan Hongdao frowned and said, "So it turns out that young Master Chang guessed correctly that His Majesty wanted to start a war." Lin Ruofu shook his head. When His Majesty went on the northern expedition, he was not able to achieve full success and has always been brooding over it. Now that the eldest princess has given him such a good excuse, even if His Majesty does not like her taking matters into her own hands, he still has to accept her kindness. However, the matter of the peace treaty back then was too complicated. At most, Your Majesty will take a few small countries and give Northern Qi a taste of his power. Yuan Hongdao sighed. Princess Royal's intelligence is astonishing, it's really difficult to deal with her. Lin Ruofu slowly closed his eyes and said, "I have never thought of dealing with her, leave it to the juniors." "Yes, my lord." Just then there was a commotion outside the study. No one knew who dared to make such a racket in the middle of the night, but judging from the expressions of the Prime Minister and Yuan Hongdao, they clearly knew who was outside. The door was pushed open and a fat man in his 20s walked in. The old nannies and servants behind him did not stop him, and dared to stand outside the study and ask for forgiveness from the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's manor had strict rules, and without the Prime Minister's permission, anyone who entered the study without permission would be severely punished. Lin Ruofu waved his hand to indicate that he understood, then looked at the fat man with a gentle expression and said quietly, "De Bao, why are you not being good again?" The fat man called De Bao had a very wide space between his eyebrows, and his eyes were somewhat blank. It looked like there was something wrong with his brain development. But hearing Lin Ruofu's words, he immediately quieted down and said shyly, "De Bao is good, it's just that little brother hasn't come back yet." This was Lin Ruofu's eldest son. When he was young he had an illness and as a result he became like this. He had always had the intelligence of a 3 or 4-year-old, so he rarely went out. The people of the capital sympathized with the Prime Minister's plight, and did not mention this matter. De Bao was usually the closest to Lin Gong, but he had not seen his little brother for the past 2 days, so he became irritated. Lin Ruofu's heart ached as if it was being twisted. He held his chest and after a while he gently said, Bao has gone out and will be back in a few days. De Bao, be a good boy and go to sleep." De Bao finally calmed down, and with an awkward smile on his face, he was led to the back courtyard by the old nannies to sleep. After a moment of silence, Lin Ruofu said coldly, "I only have a son and a daughter and De Bao is like this. Brother Yuan, what do you think I should do?" Yuan Hongdao frowned. "If you think about the young master, it is not a good idea for Miss Chen to marry Fan Xian. After all, it seems that young Master Fan will not be able to escape political strife, and it will be difficult for him to live a stable life. In the future, it will not be convenient to entrust young Master Fan to Miss Qin. Lin Ruofu shook his head, and there was a chill in his voice. As long as his surname is Fan, he will not be able to escape. So I would rather he be a cruel and merciless person. That way he can protect Qin'er and her brother for the rest of their lives. Having said this, he immediately regained his composure. He walked behind the desk and pulled back the veil. Looking at the map of the world behind it, he began to frown in silence. His gaze occasionally swept in the direction of Dongyi, but most of it stopped at the north of the kingdom of Qin, and the complicated network of small vassal states between the kingdom of Qin and northern Qi. After a long time, Lin Ruofu frowned. We need to come up with a strategy immediately. Although it may not be a war and the two sides may not come into direct contact, the northern prefectures need to transport food and horses to those small states. We must make preparations in advance. Yuan Hongdao made a sound of acknowledgement. Then he heard the Prime Minister begin to cough. The coughing was so urgent that it seemed as if tears were forming in the corners of his eyes. The Prime Minister stood in front of the map with his hands clasped behind his back. He frowned as if he had not lost a son that day. Yuan Hongdao looked at his back and sighed in his heart. He felt slightly moved and guilty. Ruofu had lived a rich and noble life, but he had never had a comfortable one. It could be said that one meeting with the princess had ruined his life. All of these things happened in one day. No one knew what these secret deals and quarrels meant. The meeting between Count Sinan and Qin Pingping, and the private meeting between the Prime Minister and the eldest princess. No more than 10 people in the court knew about these two matters. So Fan Xian did not know that his future had already been arranged for him to walk on a golden path. If the past few months after entering the capital had been like the darkness before dawn, with thick viscous ink covering his face, he would feel pressured and unable to relax. But in the following days, it was as if God had suddenly brought a basin of clean water and splashed it on his face. It made him feel refreshed and at ease, and also made him extremely clear-headed. These days he kept telling himself that his second brother-in-law's death had nothing to do with him. Only then could he face Lin Wanner, who was the most difficult person to face. Ever since Lin Wanner learned of her second brother's death, she had been in low spirits. Although they had only met a few times, they were connected by blood and she was still sad. Fan Xian saw all of this and felt bad. Although his second brother-in-law was the mastermind behind his death, he sometimes felt that he was a bit cold-blooded and morbid. If he had heard back in Danzhou that Fan Xizha had died in the capital, perhaps he would not have felt the slightest bit of sadness. Of course, the situation now was different. Lady Lu seemed to have tacitly approved of the current situation, and the Lu family in the capital had also sensed that something was amiss. They had given Lady Lu enough information to refer to, so Lady Lu was unusually calm, and no longer prevented Fan Xizha from following Fan Xian around the capital. What made Fan Xian feel most at ease was that no one, including the Prime Minister, seemed to suspect that the death of the second son of the Prime Minister had anything to do with him. In fact, he and King Jing were overthinking this matter. That day Wu Bowen and Lin Gong had been hidden so well that even the Overwatch Council could not find them. Aside from the 4 Grandmasters, who else could find them? As long as no one knew of Fan Xian's relationship with Wu Zhu, no one would suspect that Fan Xian had anything to do with Lin Gong's death. What was even more surprising to Fan Xian was that, after many messages, he received some vague information from the Prime Minister's manner. The Prime Minister had expressed some degree of approval for the October wedding. Just as Fan Xian was wondering if the old man had truly become disheartened at seeing his son die, the crafty Count Sinan, Fan Jian, understood the reason behind this before anyone else in the court. For some reason, the Prime Minister and the Eastern Palace or the eldest princess were at odds. This was Lin Ruofu looking for a new investment direction. Perhaps it was a sign that the Prime Minister's political focus had begun to shift towards the second prince. The 2 assassinations, one after the other, shook the skies of the capital like 2 bolts of spring thunder. But after the spring thunder there was no rain, and the matter gradually faded. But the Prime Minister seemed to be grieving over the death of his son, and became somewhat disheartened. He rarely attended court, citing his illness. The crippled Director Qin also did not attend court much. He only stayed in the courtyard, occasionally issuing a few orders. Thinking of this, Fan Xian was puzzled. Why did Qin Pingping not summon him after returning to the capital? He still did not know that the cripple had been spying on him in the celestial prison. Even more puzzled was that Qin Pingping had clearly returned to the capital. So where had Fei Ti gone? In any case, after this short but bitter confrontation, the various powers in the imperial court paid the price of a few lives and rebuilt a somewhat fragile balance. Some people accepted changes that they had no choice but to accept, such as the change of control of the palace treasury in a few years. Others began to find another way to protect themselves and their families, such as the Prime Minister. These changes were undoubtedly extremely beneficial to Fan Xian. At least he did not have to worry too much about his personal safety. Only now did he write a letter to his grandmother, who was far away in Danzhou. He told her that he was doing very well in the capital, and asked her not to worry too much. After spring came summer. Although this was nonsense for Fan Xian, who had finally found a foothold in Jingdou, there was finally less of the rain in his life and more of the bright, sunny days. Happy days seemed to be slowly waving at him from the other side. Summer had come. Could the autumn wedding be far behind? Chapter 106. The imperial edict had already been sent to Dongyi, but Dongyi had only humbly and flatteringly replied to the edict, offering a large sum of gold and silver. They refused to admit that they had anything to do with the manor at the foot of Tsang Mountain. This was a response anyone could imagine. The great grandmaster who guarded Dongyi's sword lodge alone maintained his pride. At the same time, he did not want to bring disaster to the millions of people surrounding Dongyi, so he could only remain silent. The situation in the north was tense. The evidence of northern Qi's meddling in the internal affairs of the Qin kingdom was a fact that they could not defend themselves. So the two sides trained their troops on the border, and small conflicts broke out between the small vassal states that each side controlled. It seemed that a war was about to break out. Dark clouds floated in the north of the Qin kingdom, but it was midsummer in the capital. People wandered about freely, enjoying the peace and prosperity that came with a flourishing age. Fan Xian was also one of them. Although the incident at Nyolan Street had not ended with his own hands, it could be considered as an explanation to himself and those who had died. And in the process of handling this matter, he learned many things. Although every step he took was actually relying on the power of the Overwatch Council, he learned a lot about the Overwatch Council's procedures. Other than what Fei Jie had taught him all those years ago, he learned a lot more about the Overwatch Council's procedures. The summer was hard to endure. The lawsuit between the Fan family and the Guo family had finally come to an end. In the eyes of many, this was already a small matter. Since Fan Xian had become the functionary of Taichang Temple, he would naturally become a noble of some princess in the palace. The insignificant Guo family facing the palace did not dare to meddle. So they had long since withdrawn the lawsuit, and Fan Xian had finally obtained permission to leave the capital. After such a terrible event, Fan Xian dared to immediately leave the capital. It had to be said that it was a very bold move. But now there were always many people following him to protect him. There were old people from the Fan Manor, and there were people from the Overwatch Council. Now Fan Xian had a secret identity, commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Other than Wang Qinian, he had also recruited a few new faces from all over the place. One morning before the scorching sun rose, the three young masters of the Fan Manor climbed into a carriage. Under the protection of the guards and Wang Qinian's squad, they drove out of the capital and arrived at the Fan Manor not far from the capital. This trip was not to avoid the heat, but to offer sacrifices. In the cemetery, the guards had already laid out the offerings such as fruits, incense, candles, and the like. Fan Xian silently looked at the few new gravestones, and his heart was filled with complicated feelings. Ever since his rebirth, he had been holding on to his thoughts, but at this moment he became somewhat absent-minded. The smoke from the burning paper money was very heavy, and Fan Xian could not stand it anymore. He retreated to the carriage, but Ruoruo endured the smoke. She squinted her eyes and held her brother's sleeve as she stood in front of the grave. She knew that the three guards who were laid to rest here had died for her brother's sake, so her heart was filled with gratitude. Furthermore, she had been taught about this in Fan Xian's letters since she was a child, so she did not think that paying respects to servants was against the rules. In the smoke, a few new guards stood silently behind Fan Xian. Whether it was because of the smoke or the fire, the men's eyes were slightly red. The way they looked at their young master's back was different. After a while, one of the guards kindly advised, "Young master, you've come to see these brothers. It's good enough that you've come to see them. There's a lot of smoke here, so let's go back to the manor." Fan Xian's eyes were also badly stained by the smoke. He smiled and rubbed them. He listened to the guard and got into the carriage. In the carriage, Fan Xian was looking at the accounts of Dambo bookstore for the past month. Seeing his brother and sister enter, he shifted his seat and suddenly lowered his voice. "Big brother, is this a trick to buy people's hearts?" Fan Xian's mood was somewhat gloomy. He smiled and ignored him. He used his hand to ruffle the hair on Fan Xian's big head. You have to believe that there are some things in this world that are true. A heartless man may not necessarily be a true hero. Fan Ruoruo softly said, "How can a man not love his son?" Fan Xian looked at his sister with some surprise. "You." Ruoruo lowered her head and explained, "Brother said it once a few days ago, so I remembered it." Fan Xizha was very happy to find that his sister was so thoughtful and intelligent. "Remember," he said softly, "this was said by a man named Zhou." Fan Xizha looked at him and muttered, "Oh, you've changed your pen name again? When are you going to bring out the last dozen or so chapters of Story of the Stone?" Fan Xian didn't have the energy to do that, but hearing the word pen name made him feel unreasonably embarrassed. He thought to himself that explaining who wrote it was indeed a bit redundant. He was slightly angry and embarrassed, so he continued to lecture Fan Xizha. Perhaps people's hearts can be bought, but things like feelings are formed naturally. If people don't have feelings, then wouldn't they become monsters? Living in this world, not caring about anything, not recognizing family, not caring about life and death. Even if you become an immortal, what's the point? Fan Xizha shook his head and retorted, "You're not an immortal." "How do you know if being an immortal is good or not?" Fan Xian responded quickly. "I'm not an immortal. I'm a human, so I know that being an immortal and not being able to live forever must feel terrible." Suddenly Fan Xian thought of Uncle Wu Zhu, and a strong feeling of unease and self-blame welled up in his heart. He was worried that when Uncle Wu Zhu grew old, he would become a lonely old man who couldn't speak, but Wu Zhu insisted on hiding in the dark, and Fan Xian had no way of finding him. The carriage left the clan's graveyard and followed the widest ridge between the fields, making its way to the estate with some difficulty. When the carriage arrived at the foot of a large slope on the outskirts of the estate, the people of the estate came out to greet them. It wasn't just tenant farmers who lived there, but also a few destitute families of the Fan clan. They couldn't stay in such a prosperous and expensive place like the capital, so they had to move to the nearby farms. But they didn't have land and they couldn't bring themselves to pay rent like the tenant farmers. Count Sinan wasn't someone who was willing to spend money to take care of his poor relatives, but he couldn't just watch them starve to death. So for now, these Fan clansmen only helped the Fan Manor look after the farms and took care of the affairs here, so that they could earn some money each month to support their families. Strangely, Count Sinan never mentioned Fan Xian's ancestral homecoming, and Fan Xian pretended to have forgotten. He still had some questions that he couldn't explain. However, in the capital today, there was no longer anyone who looked down on Fan Xian as an illegitimate child. In the Fan clan, they knew that the future of the Fan clan would probably depend on this beautiful young master, so they were especially respectful. Fan Xian took the cup of tea handed to him by the elder and drank it in one gulp. He nodded to the people around him, then followed the guard to a small courtyard on the west side of the forest. This was Ting Zijing's courtyard. Once inside, Fan Xian found that Ting Zijing had already gotten up and was waiting obediently in the courtyard. Ting Zijing looked at Fan Xian and said awkwardly, "Young master, I wanted to go out to greet you, but Hosanna wouldn't let me." Fan Xian didn't stand on ceremony with him. He helped him into the central room and explained, "Don't blame Hosanna, I said that." Hosanna was one of Fan Xian's newly recruited guards. He had been at the front of the country estate. Fan Xian looked at Ting Zijing's slightly stout face and asked, "How's your leg?" Ting Zijing laughed. "It's nothing. I can move it now. I'll probably be able to return to the capital in a few days. If you think it's not easy to recover here, you might as well go back to the capital." As they spoke, Ting Zijing's wife and daughter came in to greet their master. Fan Ruoruo handed out the money and asked Ting Zijing's 5-year-old daughter a few questions. She then carried the child out, leaving the men in the room. Fan Xizha was still calculating, and even Ting Zijing's greeting was only a grunt of acknowledgement. Fan Xian looked at his brother helplessly and listened to Ting Zijing's explanation. He'll stay in the manor for now. After all, his wife and son are here. Once he's recovered, he'll naturally return to the capital to serve the young master. The two of them could be considered to have experienced life and death together, so their conversation was much more direct. Fan Xian nodded and praised him. "You sure know how to enjoy your wife and child heating the Kong." Ting Zijing laughed. "It's so hot today. If the Kong gets any hotter, you'll suffer from internal heat." Danzhou's climate was excellent. It was warm in the winter and cool in the summer, so no one used Kong beds. After entering the capital, it happened to be spring in summer, so Fan Xian didn't have the opportunity to sleep on the large Kong. Hearing this, he pressed down on the Kong he was sitting on and found that it was cool and comfortable. His eyes turned, and he thought that if he were to live in the middle of the Tsang Mountains for a while after his marriage, He would have to find a way to make a Kong bed. Ting Zijing had no idea that the young master's mind had suddenly wandered to the winter snow mountains after October. Young master, eat some fruit and then return to the manor. There's nothing good to eat in this manor. Besides, if we delay any longer, it will be too late to get back to the capital. I'm afraid we won't be able to get through the city gates. Fan Xian smiled and waved his hand. Before we came, I told my father that the three of us will stay the night in this manor and return tomorrow. We've been working hard in the capital for the past few months, and it's rare that we have a chance to have some peace and quiet. Although we don't dare to stay too long, you should at least entertain us for one night. Only now did Ting Zijing know that he was planning to spend the night. He quickly called his wife in and had her prepare guest rooms, hot water and the like. Although life in the manor was not luxurious, there were many people. As soon as they heard that the young master of Fan Manor was going to spend the night there, a dozen middle-aged wives began to make arrangements. Before long everything was ready. Fan Xian rolled his eyes and moved closer to Ting Zijing's ear. Arrange for the people following me to stay somewhere close. Chapter 107. Ting Zijing glanced at Wang Qinian, who had been standing quietly behind Fan Xian. Sensing that his scent was different from that of the guards in the manor, he responded in a low voice. Fan Xian looked into his eyes and said in a low voice, "This is Wang Qinian. I have a part-time position in the Overwatch Council. Don't tell anyone else." Ting Zijing's expression froze, and the way he looked at Fan Xian changed. After all, he did not think that the young master he had once wanted to follow would be able to sneak into the forbidden courtyard within a few months of entering the capital. Fan Xian called Wang Qinian over and introduced him. "This is Ting Zijing, the one I mentioned when we met for the second time. You two should get to know each other better. He saved my life before." Hearing this, Ting Zijing's dark face turned red. He waved his hands. "Young master, you speak too seriously. Actually, it was you who saved my life that day." Wang Qinian put his hands together and smiled. He said nothing. Like Ting Zijing, he was very satisfied with the current situation. Not only had he successfully returned to the Overwatch Council, but his monthly salary had also increased considerably. The director had even personally received him once. Ever since he had become a civil servant many years ago, it had been a long time since he had received such treatment. Although Master Fan was only an 8th-level functionary of Taichung Temple, he had a commissioner's token on him. Apart from his own team, only the head of the Overwatch Council and Mu Tai knew about this commissioner. No one else knew. This kind of mysterious power in his hands made him feel very comfortable. They had wild game for dinner. Although Ting Zijing had repeatedly said that there was nothing good to eat in the country estate, the fatty meat boiling in the pot, coupled with the tender green vegetables, was incredibly delicious. Even Fan Xija's appetite was whetted, and he snatched the meat as if there was no one else around. Fan Xian looked at him, amused. He picked up a piece of meat and brought it to his lips. He found that the meat was very tender, but the layers of skin were clear and it was very chewy. He couldn't help but praise it. "Is this moose or what?" Ting Zijing's wife, who was standing to one side, hurriedly replied, "This is white moose meat." Hearing the words by Mozi, Fan Xian froze. He placed his chopsticks in front of him as if he had forgotten to move. In this instant he thought of a time many years ago, even longer than Danzhou. At the time he was lying in bed, constantly thinking of eating white elk meat, and the pretty nurse teased him about his wild imagination. In his previous life, Fan Xian had never eaten white elk meat, only that it was the favorite game of his hometown. These memories seemed to have faded, and it had been a long time since Fan Xian had thought of the events of his previous life. Unexpectedly, the white elk meat today had stirred up the emotions he had hidden for a long time. Fan Ruoruo took small bites from the side. Seeing that her brother's expression seemed a little strange, she carefully asked, "What's wrong?" Fan Xian immediately woke up and smiled slightly. "Nothing." He turned his head to ask Ting Zijing if any of the mountain products had been preserved. After receiving a positive answer, he happily asked Ting Zijing to help him pack up a few dozen caddies of meat to take back to the capital. Ting Zijing had not expected that the things he had prepared today would be to the young master's liking, and was very happy. Fan Xian picked up his wine cup and drank with the others at the table. "Ting Zijing," he said with a smile, "you haven't fully recovered yet. You should drink less." Next to him, Fan Ruoruo looked at her brother and smiled as if to embarrass him. Fan Xian knew that his sister had guessed what he was thinking. Apart from wanting to eat it himself, the main purpose of bringing the preserved game back to the capital was for the gluttonous Wanner to enjoy. After dinner, Fan Xija, in an extremely perverted manner, went back to his room to calculate the accounts. Fan Xian really didn't know what fun there was in calculating accounts, and how could a 12 or 13-year-old bully be able to revel in boring numbers? He could only sigh and let him be. Refusing Teng Zijing's request to accompany him on his crutch, he led Fan Ruoruo to the edge of the field outside the courtyard. They looked at the round moon that seemed to be floating quietly among the green hills. Above their heads, the unknown trees rustled in the night wind. It was a very beautiful scene. The dream is still in front of the body. I suspect it is in the dream. How many people are haggard? How many people return? Fan Xian thought of the events of his previous life, and occasionally sighed with emotion. He casually recited 2 sentences. Time is a passerby for 100 generations. Heaven and earth, the journey of all things. Life is a great dream. Sometimes I wonder if I am still lying on that bed, dreaming a dream that has lasted so long that I have yet to wake up. He casually sighed, knowing that his sister probably didn't understand what he was saying. But he had forgotten the elegance hidden in Master Li Bai's words, and how lethal they were to a young girl. As expected, Fan Ruoruo's eyes began to shine. Fan Xian immediately knew that he had made a mistake. With a distressed expression, he prepared to explain that other than the first 2 sentences, the rest had been written by a great man named Li Bai. But then he suddenly remembered that Xia had mocked him earlier in the day. He secretly sighed and stopped what others might think was a pretentious action, but to him it seemed very natural. He also knew that even if he said it, his sister wouldn't believe him. After all, the Overwatch Council had arrested a number of Xankijis, but none of them were salt smugglers who knew how to write poetry. So he simply pulled Ruoruo into his arms and looked at the moon together. Although Fan Xian had lived in this world for more than 10 years, he still retained some of his unique temperament. This temperament did not match with this world, but for him, it had great benefits. For example, the precaution between men and women, and for example, physical contact. When he held his sister, of course, there was not the slightest thought of a man and a woman, only a very pure brotherly love. On the contrary, when Fan Ruoruo was held in his arms, she felt warm and slightly shy, and naturally forgot to ask about those things. In the distance, 2 members of the Overwatch Council stood under another tree like 2 iron rods, protecting their safety. Get up early tomorrow. I have business in the city. Fan Xian sniffed his sister's hair, and found it to be a faint orchid scent. He asked curiously, what method did you use? Fan Ruoruo was slightly embarrassed. She didn't know what to say to her brother. It's pear blossom water. Why are you in such a hurry? In this world, girls rarely wash their hair, so the smell was not very good. Even when Fan Xian and Si Lily rolled around in the same bed, it was the same. It was all covered up by the strong fragrance. Ever since Fan Xian had entered the capital, he had shamelessly asked Fan Ruoruo and Lin Wan'er to wash their hair often. He even gave them the shower head and wooden bucket design he had made in Danzhou for free. Ruoruo and Wan'er couldn't dissuade him, so they did as he asked. They didn't expect the effect to be so obvious. It immediately spread throughout Fan Manor and the royal courtyard. Now even Lady Lu washed her hair more frequently. Father should be very happy. This was Fan Xian's unspoken reply. He then replied to Ruoruo, the capital is quieter in the morning. I have a place to go. You come with me and the others don't need to follow. Knowing that her brother trusted her, Fan Ruoruo was very moved. Fan Xian then said, tomorrow I have to go to Qingyu Hall to take a look. Shopkeeper Yi and I have discussed it. The capital has been relatively quiet lately, so it's a good time to go and see. The shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall lived up to his reputation. Fan Xizha was in charge of planning the accounts, and shopkeeper Yi was in charge of implementing them. Dongbo Bookstore's business was doing better and better. Relying on his family's wealth and his official background, he had managed to take over all of the other booksellers on the neighboring streets within 2 months. Recently, he had slowly extended his reach to the neighboring counties. Is the tofu shop still open? Fan Ruoruo suddenly thought of a small matter. The crown prince is interested in the soy milk you bring to the manor every day. He's afraid that he won't be able to drink it someday. Doesn't he always tell you to open it? Fan Xian smiled. I'm about to become a man who earns hundreds of thousands of silver a day. Why would I care about that tofu? Of course this was just a naughty joke. He continued, whenever you have time you can do it. You don't have anything to do right now anyway, so you can find something to do. In his mind, there was no such thing as a young lady not being able to show her face in public, much less take care of a tofu shop. He just felt that if Ruoruo read and wrote poetry every day she wouldn't become stupid. Fan Ruoruo was a little embarrassed, but she still agreed. Fan Xian thought of something important and frowned. Holding his sister's shoulders with both hands, he said seriously, Ruoro, although it seems to me that you're only 15 or 16 years old, and it's still too early for you to get married. But the atmosphere in the capital really isn't good. Even a young man like me is being forced to marry. You have to be careful. If you want to pick someone you like Hizongwei who comes to the manor every day. I kicked him out with 3 strokes of the broom. But what if I get married to a good-for-nothing? He said very seriously, if you're going to marry then you have to pick someone yourself. If you're going to marry someone you like, then you have to make your move early before the marriage is set. Setting up a marriage is too risky. After all, not everyone in this world is as lucky as me and one. If it's an order from my parents, I have enough confidence that I can handle it. But what if it's an edict from the palace? Given the position of the Fan family, we have to guard against this. Hearing her brother's words, Fan Ruoro first felt a bit embarrassed. When she heard him boast about himself, she felt it was funny. It was only when she heard the words palace that she truly felt a bit worried. How could she not know that in an official's family at her age, they would indeed be engaged? It was just that, spending every day with her brother looking at the men of the world made her feel bored. How could she find the one she liked? Chapter 108. On the morning of the second day, the sky was not yet bright, and a thin mist floated in the mountains. The moon from last night had already moved to the opposite field. The carriages of Fan Manor did not disturb anyone in the fields, and headed in the direction of the capital. Teng Zijing and his wife stood at the gate to see them off, leaning on his crutches. Next to them, his daughter was rubbing her eyes as if she had not woken up yet. The carriages arrived at the gates of the capital, but today was different from the day they had arrived. The markings on the carriages of Fan Manor were very eye-catching. The guards of the city patrol who had just opened the gates inspected them and let the carriages into the city. After all, the previous commander of the city patrol, Jiao Ziheng, had been stripped of his position because of the assassination attempt on the eldest son of the Fan family. The guards of the city patrol, seeing the round markings on the Fan family carriages, did not dare to make things difficult for them. When the carriages arrived at Fan Manor, Fan Xizha yawned and got out of the carriage. He told the servants who came to greet him, there are dried goods in the carriages. Take them to the back and put them away. You are not allowed to eat them. They are a favor prepared by Big Brother. He then glared at them and roared, if you dare to eat them tomorrow and Sister Lin finds that they only have 3 legs, I will personally chop off one of your legs to repay the debt. The servants had long since become accustomed to this young master's tyrannical temper. They did not dare to make a sound, and obediently unloaded the goods from the carriages. The guards also got out of the carriages in the back. Wang Qinian walked to the side of the carriage, quietly waiting for Fan Xian to come down. Unexpectedly, after a long time, there was no movement from the carriage. He opened the curtain and was shocked to see that there was no one inside. Fan Xian and Fan Ruoro had disappeared. He hurriedly ran behind Fan Xizha and asked, Young master, may I ask where Master Fan is? Fan Xizha looked back at him and lectured, Look at how nervous you are. My brother and sister got off the carriage on the way here. They probably went on an outing and they don't like to see you following them. Wang Qinian was scared out of his wits. It was all thanks to Master Fan that he was able to return to the Overwatch Council. When Director Qin Pingping had personally received him, he had repeatedly exhorted him to ensure Master Fan's safety, and to not let him leave his sight. Who would have thought that Master Fan would leave them behind on a trip out of the city? Seeing his nervous expression, Fan Xizha frowned and said, He said he'll be back in the afternoon. You don't have to be too nervous. In reality, he did not know the true identity of Wang Qinian and the others. At first, he thought they were aces his father had sent to Fan Xian. Later, he vaguely sensed that something was wrong, but he was too lazy to think too deeply about it. Wang Qinian no longer paid attention to the second young master. He signaled his subordinates with his eyes, then boarded the carriage and drove out of the city. In the heat of the summer, even the chirping of cicadas sounded weak. Fan Xian took Ruoro for a stroll by the Lujing River in the suburbs of the capital. Fortunately, it was still early and the river was shaded by trees, so it was still bearable. Fan Xian had long since unbuttoned his shirt, revealing a large expanse of skin on his chest. Ruoro, however, did not have this privilege. She could only fan herself with her handkerchief. Fan Xian saw how tired she was and smiled. He took the handkerchief and soaked it in the Lujing River, then handed it to her to cool her down. Do you know why this river is called the Lujing River? According to the records of the capital, this name should have been around since before the current dynasty. It seems that the river flows around the capital and enters the Tsang Mountains in the west. The terrain is undulating and in some places it flows very fast. In other places it is very quiet like a mirror or like a still crystal. That is why it is called the Lujing River. Fan Xian nodded. He thought of the quiet part of the river next to him, where pleasure boats occasionally floated. He thought of Sea Lily who was still locked up in the celestial prison. He did not know what the final outcome of welcoming that woman would be. After walking for a while, he could finally see a house among the green trees on the opposite bank of the river. It was a simple and elegant little courtyard. A few bamboos protruded from the walls of the courtyard, pointing towards the sky. In this hot summer day, it actually emitted a cold air that stood proudly in the turbid world. Is that Taiping courtyard? Fan Xian frowned as he looked in that direction. Ruoruo replied, yes. I heard that many years ago the master of the Yi family lived here. Later, the Yi family's property was taken over by the palace treasury, and this courtyard became a courtyard for the royal family. But when I often chat with Ruojia, I have never heard of any lady living here. Fan Xian grunted and nodded. Suddenly, a smile blossomed on his face. So this was where his mother had worked, fought, and lived. Ruoruo saw the smile on her brother's face and for some reason felt very happy. She asked, what makes you so happy? Fan Xian rubbed his sweaty fingers and shook his head. He did not say anything. Bringing his sister here today was already a very bold thing to do. Although from what he had seen in the capital, the Yi family did not seem to be much of a taboo. But since his father and Wu Zhu were so cautious, it was better for him to be careful, and so he did not say anything. He had come here today to take a look, mainly because he wanted to enter the courtyard to pay his respects. But since it had become a courtyard for the royal family, it was not convenient for him to go. It was just that he did not know where his mother's grave was, and that made him feel a little uncomfortable. After coming to this world, he had never seen the woman who had given birth to him. But for some reason he had thought of her as his mother. Perhaps it was because in his previous life, his parents had died early and left nothing behind, so he did not have time to grow attached to his mother. But after coming to the kingdom of Qing, whether it was his escape at the beginning of his rebirth, everything in Danzhou, or the many miraculous encounters after coming to the capital, all of it seemed to reveal the power, and determination that the woman had once possessed. It reminded him that his mother was that woman named Yi Qingmei. Yi Qingmei looked down on all the men in the world. Fan Xian had even wondered if his mother had not died at all. Perhaps she was hiding in a corner far away, wearing a gentle yet cold smile, silently watching his every move in this world, every struggle and every escape. But Count Sinan coldly interrupted all these fantasies. He said that his mother's grave was in a very secluded place in the capital, and that when the time was right, he would naturally go and pay his respects. Fan Xian sighed, knelt down and kowtowed in the direction of the small courtyard on the other side of the river. Fan Ruoruo was slightly startled, not understanding what her brother meant. But as intelligent as she was, she immediately guessed something. She could not help but pale with fright, but she immediately forced herself to calm down. She knelt down with Fan Xian and bowed in the direction of the other side of the river. With the cover of the trees, even if there were people on the other side, it would be difficult to see them. A pair of snow-white lovers were kneeling on the ground, bowing in the direction of the river. It was a very interesting scene. Fan Xian was a little surprised. He took her little hand and stood up. Why are you kneeling with me? Ruoruo forced a smile. What should I call you? Auntie? Fan Xian chuckled. I knew you would be able to guess. I didn't want to hide it from you when I brought you here today. There are some things that only I know and I can't tell anyone. It's a depressing thing. Fan Ruoruo sighed. No wonder you lived in Danzhou when you were young. Fan Xian said, I only know that my mother is the one from the Yi family. Did you not hear Father or Lady Lu mention this when you were young? Fan Ruoruo thought for a moment, then shook her head helplessly. Fan Xian sighed. He guessed that it was probably because the palace hated the fact that the Yi family had a descendant, so his father had always kept this matter a secret. But given the power of the court, if Count Sinan had been involved with the mistress of the Yi family, how could this relationship have escaped the attention of the palace? Unless the Overwatch Council had kept it a secret for his father. But no matter how much Chen Pingping respected his mother, and wanted to save his own life, he should not have been able to keep this matter a secret. All sorts of questions welled up in his mind, making him unusually angry. He was a motherless child, so be it. But now he was beginning to doubt the other half of him. This kind of psychological trend was quite unpleasant. The brother and sister did not dare to get too close to the courtyard. They walked through the forest and onto the official road, following it in the direction of the capital. They planned to go a bit further and find a courier to bring a carriage over. After walking for a short distance, they found a small path on the official road leading to the left. Every step along the path, there was a blue stone hidden in the grass. It was covered in moss, making it extremely difficult to see. It looked rather unique and seemed to be rarely used. Fan Xian's eyesight was excellent. He could see a small wooden bridge at the end of the path, presumably leading to Taiping Courtyard. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He forced his gaze to look away and smiled. The handkerchief is already dry. Is it too hot? Fan Roro always seemed to have an indissoluble coldness between her brows, but she did not feel this way in front of Fan Xian. Now, beads of sweat seeped out from the fine hair on her forehead, slowly dripping onto her slightly red cheeks. It added a bit of color, but it made Fan Xian slightly surprised. She softly replied that she was fine, and continued to walk forward with her brother. After walking for a short while, they came to a tea shop. The shop was made entirely of green bamboo, and it was very cool and refreshing. Fan Xian was delighted to see it. He took his sister's hand and rushed in, yelling, "2 cups of tea." What answered him was a thick silence. There were not many people in the tea shop. A middle-aged man stood at the innermost table. Hearing Fan Xian's voice, he slowly turned his head. His eyes were sunken, and his nose was like an eagle's hook. Although he was full of malice, today he was forcefully restraining it. The middle-aged man looked at Fan Xian with an unfriendly expression, as if he was looking at a little white rabbit. Fan Xian was shocked. He recognized the man as the leader of the guards, Gong Dian, who had exchanged blows with him outside the Qing temple and caused him to vomit blood. Wang Qinian had been kicked out of the Overwatch Council because he had been working hard to catch Fan Xian. Chapter 109. Gong Dian was the deputy commander of the Imperial Guard, a close official of the Emperor, and a member of the Imperial Guard. He was Yi Zhong's junior, a disciple of the Yi family, the #1 martial family in the Kingdom of Qin. He was a rare upper 8th level ace, and in terms of fighting ability he was much more powerful than Qing Jushu, whom Fan Xian had killed in the chaos. Fan Xian had killed Qing Jushu with one strike because he had underestimated him, and he had ambushed him with a precious weapon. If the two of them had really fought, Fan Xian's chances of dying would have been much higher. Facing Gong Dian, Fan Xian could not think of any good ideas. Not to mention that he could not beat him even if he could. Would he dare oppose the palace? A drop of sweat dripped from Fan Xian's forehead. In his heart he kept shouting, "Wu Zhu messed me up. Wu Zhu messed me up." If Wu Zhu had not knocked out the guards, Fan Xian would not have been able to enter the Temple of Qin, and so many things would not have happened. But for Fan Xian this was the cause of the crisis. Of course, Fan Xian could not really blame his uncle. He was just using this kind of crazed shouting to relax his mind. Gong Dian smiled and took a step forward. His deep voice rang out. "Young man, what a coincidence today." Fan Xian pulled his sister back, who did not know what was going on. He smiled and replied, "I didn't expect to see you again, sir." At this moment his mind was spinning rapidly. Wanner had once said that the nobleman in the Qing temple that day was the emperor. Then Gong Dian's duty should be to surround and protect the emperor. Now that Gong Dian had appeared in the tea house, the emperor should also be here. As he thought about it, his gaze swept past Gong Dian's thin but high shoulders. He saw a middle-aged noble drinking tea at the table, who would occasionally raise his head and look in his direction with a frown. Fan Xian was shocked, but his face did not show it. He smiled bitterly. "Sir, why are you acting like you've searched far and wide for something, only to find it all without any effort? That day outside the temple I offended you, sir, but I also coughed up blood for a few days. Consider this an apology." The words "searched far and wide" were purposely said for the noble to hear. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian did not expect the noble to react. "Capture this person." Gong Dian didn't want to alarm his master, so he ordered in a low voice. The 3 bodyguards on both sides listened to his order and rushed forward. Seeing his opponent's imposing manner, and with a young lady by his side, he knew he would not be able to escape. He frowned and stepped forward, taking the initiative to attack Gong Dian. Gong Dian was not angry, on the contrary he was delighted. He waved his hand for the guards to stand down. His 2 hands spread out like a goshawk hunting a rabbit. His knuckles were dry and strong, and they went straight for Fan Xian's pulse. Although Fan Xian did not have any exquisite moves, these little tricks were an instinctive reaction to Wu Zhu's hammering. With a strange twist of his wrist, his fingertips slid across Gong Dian's pulse. His arms suddenly lengthened and with an eerie aura, he abruptly locked onto Gong Dian's wrist. At this moment, Gong Dian's pair of iron hands had already firmly grasped his wrist. Both of them were greatly surprised. Both times, as soon as they came into contact, they immediately locked onto each other. It was really a very inexplicable thing. It was as if they had predicted each other's reaction. Although he was surprised, Gong Dian spoke with great confidence. "Give me your hands and let me capture you." Fan Xian had never expected to fight the head of the palace guards, but he had other ideas. So he frowned and said unyieldingly, "We don't know yet." He gave a muffled grunt, and the snow mountain at his back heated up. A torrent of heat gushed out from that spot, and along his arms, it attacked Gong Dian's body. Gong Dian frowned, seeming to sense the incomparably tyrannical Jinqi of the youth. But at this moment his master was behind him, so naturally he would not step aside. His eyes flashed, and with a light shout, the vigorous Jinqi that had accumulated in his body for decades gathered in his palms. Their locked arms had already loosened, and their palms were facing each other. After a muffled sound, the green bamboo tea shop was shaken. The nobleman who was drinking tea frowned. It seemed that he did not have any kung fu to protect himself. Behind Fan Xian, Ruoro's legs also weakened, and she almost fell to the ground. There was a flash of white light, and the guards drew their swords and placed them on Fan Xian's neck. At this moment, Fan Xian's arms were sore, and he had no strength to resist, nor did he think about resisting. Gong Dian coughed and put his hands behind his back. When he looked at Fan Xian again, there was something strange in his eyes. He said quietly, "Young man, I haven't seen you in a few months. You've improved again." A trickle of blood flowed from the corner of Fan Xian's mouth. This trickle of blood made Gong Dian think of the person in the gloomy room across from the Temple of Qin. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. He wasn't sure if he had done the right thing today. This time it was clear that Fan Xian had lost, but Gong Dian was not as relaxed as he appeared. Aside from the nobleman, no one noticed that his hands, which were behind his back, were trembling. The strange and tyrannical Jinqi that Fan Xian had used to invade his body remained in his meridians, scraping them like little knives. After a while it gradually calmed down. Able to use both the pen and the sword. It seems that there have been many such young talents in the world recently. The nobleman looked at Fan Xian, whose face did not change at all, with a smile of admiration on his face. Gong Dian knew that his master cherished talent, and was afraid that he would ask him to release Fan Xian like last time. He quickly walked to the side of the tea table and in a low voice, explained why he wanted to capture Fan Xian. The nobleman furrowed his brows and then gradually relaxed. His eyes, which were like deep pools, gradually brightened. He looked at Fan Xian and narrowed his eyes slightly. In a quiet voice he said, "So, it is the young man from that day." He continued quietly, "Gong Dian, the ace you spoke of could easily capture and kill you. Did you tell anyone about this?" Gong Dian was ashamed. "It was only a secret investigation. There were no results, so I did not report it. Please, forgive me, master." The nobleman said coldly, "I am excused. But this matter is not to be brought up again, or your entire family will be executed." Gong Dian's heart trembled, and he cupped his hands in acknowledgement. The two of them spoke very quietly. Even Fan Xian, with his extraordinary hearing, could only faintly hear a few words. He didn't know what they were talking about. "Leave us. I want to speak with this young man," the nobleman ordered coldly. Gong Dian was startled. Although the master held the world in his hands, he was powerless. How could he allow him to be alone with this young man? The nobleman seemed to have guessed what he was thinking. He muttered to himself, "Gong Dian, stay. The rest of you may leave." "Yes, master." Although the guards didn't understand, they didn't dare to say anything else. They quickly left the tea house. Fan Xian's neck was free and he twisted it comfortably. Ruoro ran up to him and took his hand. Thinking of the danger he had just been in, she was so anxious that she almost cried. "Functionary Fan Xian, you have been disrespectful in front of the emperor. Do you know your crime?" "I do not know what crime I have committed." The conversation Fan Xian had imagined didn't happen. The nobleman just sat at the table and looked at him with interest. The nobleman's eyes seemed to be much softer than before. They lightly but carefully brushed over his face, which made Fan Xian feel a little uncomfortable. The nobleman opened his mouth and said quietly, "Young man, which family are you from?" "Sir, we are from the Fan family. Yesterday we went to the country estate to rest. Today we wanted to see the scenery, so we wandered here." I don't know why you are making things difficult for us. Fan Xian thought it would be more appropriate to call him sir. Hearing his answer, Gong Dian was shocked. He now knew that the person he had been looking for was Fan Xian, the man who had killed an 8th-level master. Thinking of how Fan Xian's father, Count Sinan, was the master's trusted aide, and that he held some power that even he didn't know about, Gong Dian thought he understood why the master had ordered him not to reveal the existence of the Grandmaster. He looked at Fan Xian apologetically. The nobleman smiled. You are Fan Jian's son? Hearing him call his father by name, Fan Xian was even more certain of his identity. He responded with even more respect. That is correct. The nobleman nodded. This is a misunderstanding. Don't bear it in your heart. Fan Xian hadn't expected the nobleman to be so easy to talk to. He was stunned for a moment before he came to his senses. I wouldn't dare. The nobleman continued. You've been in the capital for a few months now. How have you been? Although he didn't understand why someone of his status would care about him, Fan Xian couldn't pass up this opportunity. Thinking of all the troubles he'd had in the past few months, he said with a hint of disappointment, living in the capital is not easy. It's not as good as home. You mean Danzhou? Exactly. What's so good about Danzhou? Although Danzhou is remote, the people are simple. As long as you don't harm others, no one will harm you. It's not like after you've entered the capital. Whether you want to or not, there will always be things that will come to you. The nobleman didn't seem to expect the youth to be so direct. After a slight pause, he smiled. The capital is unparalleled in its prosperity, and naturally its difficulties are also unparalleled. But with Master Fan's protection and with Master Fan's reputation as a master of both the pen and the sword, I presume you will have a comfortable life in the capital. It was as if Fan Xian was listening to a jade edict. If he hadn't been faking it, he would have knelt down and thanked the edict, and then announced it to the entire capital. The words of the emperor were like gold and jade, but his face remained calm. I hope so, he replied softly. It was getting late, and the nobleman had many matters to attend to. He got up and left. Before he left, he looked at Fan Xian carefully and smiled with satisfaction. If fate wills it, we will meet again. He then turned to Fan Ruoruo and said quietly, Little girl, when you were a baby, I held you. I didn't think you'd become a big girl in the blink of an eye. In the future, a good marriage awaits you. Fan Ruoruo was slightly taken aback. She didn't know how to respond. After saying this, the nobleman laughed brightly. He seemed to be very happy. He left the tea house where Qing Zhu was and got into his carriage. A long time after the carriage had left, the nobleman was lost in thought. He sighed. His facial features are vaguely similar. His ability to climb walls at night is somewhat similar to mine when I was young. In the tea house, Fan Ruoruo asked curiously, Who was that? He seemed to be familiar with father. Fan Xian had finally shaken off his nervousness. Covered in sweat, he sat down on a stool and said, It was His Majesty. Damn it. Why do they all like to go out incognito? Do they really think they don't have to pay for scaring people to death? As soon as he said this, Fan Ruoruo covered her mouth in shock. Crack. At that moment, a clap of thunder sounded out of nowhere in the blue sky. It was as if it wanted to pierce into the tea house's bamboo and strike a certain someone to death. Chapter 110. After casually getting some water to drink in the tea shop, the brother and sister continued on their way uneasily. Before long, they saw Wang Qinian and the others in a carriage that had come to pick them up. The other party's identity was here. His expression was strange and his mood was not very high. Wang Qinian didn't dare to say anything. Why would the emperor appear here? Fan Ruoruo leaned against the carriage and used a handkerchief to fan her slightly sweaty face. She looked very charming. Fan Xian forced a smile and replied, Our emperor has always lived in seclusion. I had long expected that a man could stay for so long in the royal palace, which is filled with the smell of palace resentment and rouge. He must often come out to relax. Walking to the Lujing riverside is a very natural thing. It was just that it was a bit fun earlier. I always thought that Sir Gong Dian would call him Master Huang. Fan Ruoruo giggled and said, How can everything be like the stories you tell? If it was really like that, you should have opened a storytelling shop a long time ago. Speaking of storytelling shops, Fan Xian immediately thought of the tofu shop. Furrowing his brows, he asked, Ruoruo, what are you planning to do in the future? Fan Ruoruo's expression darkened. In these days, after a woman married, it was to accompany her husband and children, do embroidery and take care of the backyard. Given Ruoruo's knowledge and ability, she would probably be unwilling to spend her life like this. However, she couldn't make more plans at the moment, so she could only temporarily leave it as it was. After entering the capital, the carriage went straight to the 28-li slope. The 28-li slope was not a large slope. It was just a famous name in the south of the capital. It was said that hundreds of years ago, when Jingdo was far from being as vast as it was now, the 28-li slope was the last part of the slope before entering the capital. It was a full 28 li from the last relay station on the official road in the southwest. Every time the carriage came here and traveled the last 28 li, the horses and people were tired. They were particularly tired. The last part of the slope looked even taller than Dong Mountain by the seaside. The 28 li slope's name came from this. 28 li hill had long since been absorbed into the city walls and turned into a street. Only its name remained, and Qingyu Hall was located here. The carriage stopped some distance away. Fan Xian and his sister alighted and walked along the street. Along the way they saw a neat row of small storefronts, all made of the cheap wood from Lingnan. They were painted with varnish and the wood spots were clear. If you glanced at them, you would feel as if countless one-eyed monsters were staring at you. Fan Xian was startled and asked curiously, "Why do they all use this?" This method of cooking was common in small restaurants in his previous life. It tasted like fresh wood, cheap and refreshing. Wang Qinian shook his head. He was not cut out for business. "This is Qingyu Hall," Fan Ruoruo explained. "Every door is where a shopkeeper teaches disciples. There are 17 shopkeepers, so there are 17 rooms." Fan Xian counted and found that there were more than 20 such small rooms on the side of the street. He asked his sister why, and Ruoruo said unhappily, "After all these years there are bound to be some shopkeepers who are getting old and starting to retire, or who have died of illness." The group of people chatted as they walked to the front. It was a very beautiful house with a large courtyard. Looking at the overhanging eaves of the courtyard walls, it must have been divided into many courtyards. Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat. It felt somewhat familiar, and after thinking about it, he remembered that this was similar to the Taiping manor he had seen on the banks of the Lujing River. The place where these shopkeepers lived was a little strange. The words Qingyu Hall were not written on the door. At that moment, a Fan Manor guard came forward to hand over a name card. When the gatekeeper saw the name on the card, he immediately knew that the newcomer was young Master Fan, who had recently been in the limelight in the capital. He hurriedly invited him in. Because 7th Yi was currently helping the Fan family manage the Dambo bookstore, he didn't even need to inform them. Just as they were about to enter the manor, the person in charge of supervising Qingyu Hall from the royal court came through and was about to question the identity of the guest. Wang Qinian looked at him coldly. He didn't even bother to show himself, so he let one of the younger members of his group deal with him. He followed Fan Xian into the hall. The person supervising Qingyu Hall was also a member of the Overwatch Council, so he immediately knew that he had done something unnecessary. They entered the hall, sat down and served tea. Sitting at the head of the table was a man of about 40 years of age. His brows were gentle, and it seemed that under the pressure of all these years, he had become cautious and cautious. But Fan Xian knew that this man was the head shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall, known as Big Yi. Back in the day, he had been in charge of the Yi family's most important business. He couldn't have looked as boring and useless as he was now. He couldn't help but smile. "I've always thought you were old and virtuous, but now I know you're so young." Big Yi had no idea why young Master Fan had come to Qingyu Hall today. Although more than 10 years had passed and the Yi family was no longer a taboo, he had been under house arrest in the capital for more than 10 years. His temperament was no longer as lively and bold as it used to be. His body was hunched and his spirit had faded. He smiled bitterly. "I've long been an old man. Young Master Fan, you're always funny." Fan Xian chuckled. "Let's get straight to the point. The first reason I'm here today is that the Dambo bookstore's business is excellent. I want to thank 7th Yi and I want to see what Qingyu Hall looks like." Big Yi smiled. "Young Master Fan, you've paid for the people of our hall to do things. Naturally, we should let you earn some money. If we were to lose money doing business, I'm afraid Qingyu Hall would have fallen long ago in the capital." When it came to earning money, Big Ye's countenance naturally revealed a sense of self-confidence, and his whole body glowed with brilliance. Fan Xian secretly praised him, thinking that this was how someone who had been taught by his mother should be. He cupped his hands in greeting and said politely, "Actually, I've come today to trouble you with something, Big Yi." Big Ye's heart skipped a beat. If it was just for business, Fan Xian's distinguished status would not have brought him here personally. Could it be that he was thinking of something? Big Yi had to think of the lives of the Qingyu Hall's shopkeepers, waiters and relatives. He didn't dare listen to what Fan Xian was thinking. He refused. The court has a clear rule that Qingyu Hall's people are not allowed to leave the capital. If young Master Fan is too arrogant, Qingyu Hall will not be able to help. Fan Xian laughed. Of course I know that. I've come today to ask Big Yi to be someone's teacher. As far as I know, over the years, there have always been officials from the Ministry of Revenue and Palace Treasury who have been apprenticed to Qingyu Hall. They specialize in business management. I've been very comfortable working with 7th Yi, so I'd like to introduce a student to you. Big Yi asked curiously, who could it be? Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. Big Yi understood and said quietly, honored guests have come from afar. Why don't you let my wife take Miss Fan for a stroll in the back garden? He looked at Fan Ruoruo with a smile. Although our courtyard is nothing special, it was personally designed by the master of the house. It's quite impressive. Fan Ruoruo had already understood. She smiled and followed the shopkeeper's wife to the back garden. Wang Qinian and the others were also driven out by Fan Xian. Seeing him so cautious, Big Yi couldn't help but feel afraid. He didn't know who it was that wanted to learn the way of business. Fan Xizha, my second brother. Fan Xian took a sip of tea. You must have heard of him. Big Yi was shocked. Although there was no conflict between the two sons of the Fan family, Count Sinan's property was still there. How could the son of a noble be willing to learn the way of business? Could it be that young Master Fan wanted to use this matter to prevent Fan Xizha from inheriting the title? But such a clumsy trick was too absurd and unworkable. Fan Xian hadn't expected shopkeeper Yi to think so much. He said softly, my second brother is a businessman by nature, but he is only relying on his inheritance and love to support himself. In the future, if he really wants to do something, his ability is not enough. So I hope he can have the honor of becoming a disciple of head shopkeeper. Big Yi quickly shook his head. As cautious as he was, he didn't dare get involved in such matters. He said, Assistant Minister Fan is in charge of all the money and grain in the world. This business is bigger than anyone else's. How could a mere Qingyu Hall dare to teach young Master Fan? Fan Xian was a little disappointed, but he wasn't in a hurry. According to his plan, Big Yi wouldn't be able to escape being his teacher. He sat quietly in his chair, slowly moving the Jinqi in the snowy mountain. He opened his 4 meridians, closed his eyes and muttered to himself for a while. After confirming that his sensitive ears couldn't hear anyone eavesdropping, he lowered his voice and said, There's one more thing. I don't know if Big Yi dares to listen. If you do, I'll tell you. Seeing him so secretive, Big Yi smiled helplessly. He knew that even if he didn't listen, Fan Xian would tell him anyway. As expected, Fan Xian smiled and said, I am now the functionary of Taichang Temple. Seeing him say this without a head or tail, Big Yi was a little puzzled, but he still respectfully congratulated him. He knew that this young man in front of him was about to marry a noble from the palace. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian immediately said, My fiancée is the young lady of the Lin family. He knew that although Big Yi had been sitting in the capital for 15 years many years ago, he must have had many channels to learn of certain secrets. As expected, Big Yi's expression changed dramatically. He stared at Fan Xian's eyes and said coldly, What is young Master Fan trying to say? Fan Xian lightly replied, In at most 2 years, I will be able to take control of the palace treasury, but I know that my ability is insufficient. Father's Ministry of Revenue, after all, is the wealth of the nation, and I want to manage the wealth of the palace so they can't give me much help. And I. He looked back at Big Yi's emotionless eyes and said, Need help, need your help. Chapter 111. The hall suddenly became quiet. For a long time neither of them spoke. Shopkeeper Yi was shocked. The palace treasury? He had personally taken care of that place, everything that the lady had left behind. How many years had it been since he had gotten close to it? But how could the court allow people like him to get close to that property again? As if guessing what he was thinking, Fan Xian smiled. I have read the edict summoning you to the capital. You are not allowed to invest in the business, but no one has said that you are not allowed to take over the Yi family. The temptation was too great. For the shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall, managing the properties of the manors and controlling the copper mines and salt fields was not enough for them to show their true abilities. And the palace treasury, in the eyes of the shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall, it was their property to take care of. Just look at what the eldest princess had done to the property left behind by the lady. Every time they thought of this, these professional managers felt their teeth itch with hatred. Master Fan's invitation represented the opinion of Fan Manor, and Fan Manor had a special relationship with His Majesty. Could it be that His Majesty had finally thought it through? Fan Xian stood up and smiled. This is only a suggestion. There is still a long time. You can take your time to think about it, shopkeeper. Having said that, there was nothing more to say. After Fan Ruoruo returned from her boring stroll, the people of Fan Manor took their leave. Shopkeeper Yi respectfully saw them out the door and watched them get into the carriage. Only then did he wipe the cold sweat from his forehead. Fan Xian suddenly poked his head out of the carriage. His beautiful face was as bright as the sun. He called out loudly, "Shopkeeper, if you have really thought it through, remember to call someone to the manor. I will bring my second brother and some cured meat to pay respects to you." Shopkeeper Yi heard him call out, thinking that Fan Xian was going to talk about taking care of the troublesome property in front of everyone. He was startled, but when he heard that it was about that matter, he calmed down. He knew that Fan Xian was reminding him that if he was willing to accept the conditions, he would have to become Fan Xian's teacher. But Shopkeeper Yi didn't understand. Why did he have to bring cured meat to become a teacher? He frowned. It seemed that many years ago, it was either 9th Yi or 23rd Yi who had mentioned cured meat. Why did 9th Yi and 23rd Yi bring it up? He slapped his forehead and returned to Qingyu Hall, somewhat sorrowful that his memory had indeed deteriorated. On the carriage back to the manor, Fan Xian was also a bit tired. He had never been a person who liked to scheme. However, for himself, for the Fan family, and for many people, he had to do something. In his plan, the original Yi family's business would be slowly taken over by his second brother. After all, his talent in business was not as good as that kid's. As for the rest, he would take his time. Only now did he understand what teacher Fei Jie had told him in Danzhou. The matters of your family are far more complicated than you can imagine. It involves not only your own survival but also the lives of many others, so you must be careful. In the years before you grow up, you have to learn how to protect yourself. Only then will you have the ability to protect others in the future. In the future, who will I protect? Fan Xian was puzzled. Fei Jie smiled and pointed at his own nose. For example, people like me who are already inseparable from you. So Fan Xian had to do something to protect people like Ruoruo Waner and the Fan family who were already inseparable from him. At the same time, he wanted his mother's old subordinates in Qingyu Hall to live a little happier. Of course, at this moment he still did not think that there would come a day when teacher Fei Jie or those old monsters like Qin Pingping would need his protection. Master Fan's visit to Qingyu Hall was a big deal, at least for the many people in Qingyu Hall with the surname Yi. Business was, after all, the end of the road. Although these shopkeepers had earned who knew how much money for the prince's manor and the officials' families, they still could not show their faces in public. So very few people of status would personally visit Qingyu Hall. In the secret meeting in the back garden, when shopkeeper Yi revealed the purpose of Master Fan's visit, the people sitting around the round table turned pale with fright. Some of them began to recall the glory of the past, while others paled at the ruthlessness of the palace. There is no need to think too much about it. Since Master Fan dared to make this suggestion, he will certainly find a way to persuade the palace. Shopkeeper Yi looked at the other council members and frowned. It depends on what everyone thinks. There are 5 of us, and according to the old rules, everyone has 1 vote and I have 2. However, Old Six is currently doing business with Fan Manor, so I asked him to give us some advice. The other shopkeepers turned their gazes to the 7th Yi of Dambo bookstore. He lowered his head in thought, then said, "The relationship between Master Fan and Master Fan is much better than we imagined. Master Fan may seem indifferent, but in reality he is extremely ambitious. Everyone knows that he has made a name for himself in the capital. From what I see in his daily actions, it seems as if he doesn't care about Count Sinan's estate. Furthermore, the people he associates with are all powerful people like Crown Prince Jing." Shopkeeper Yi nodded. "It is still early, but we must prepare early." One of the council members raised an objection. Why take the risk? It was not easy for everyone to keep their lives, and these years have been smooth sailing. It's not really a risk. After all, so many years have passed. I think the palace should be relieved of us. Besides, we don't leave the capital, and our lives are in the hands of the court. Another person shook his head. We are only merchants and we cannot rebel. What is there to be afraid of? I really want to take over those things again. Just thinking about it makes me excited. I haven't blown a glass pot in many years. Back then, I was the best at it among all of you. This sentence seemed to tug at everyone's fond memories and they all laughed. Someone jokingly scolded, "The lady said you were a big boaster back then." The man was embarrassed. I'm not you, he said. Back then I liked to blow bubbles in the soap factory. Ida smiled and raised his hand to stop the clamor of these old men. Do you have any other opinions? He asked. The first council member who raised an objection stopped laughing and said calmly, First, we must confirm that the palace has given us permission before we can do it. Although we all want to return to the place where we started, safety is still the most important thing. The lady said back then that as long as we are alive, anything is fine. Eldest Yi frowned. Fan Manor used to have a good relationship with the Yi family. These years, the Overwatch Council and Count Sinan have taken good care of us. I don't think Count Sinan will betray us. The council member said coldly, Don't forget, the Li family used to have a good relationship with the Yi family. In the end, we were still betrayed by them. Li was the surname of the country, so the Li family was naturally the royal family. As soon as this was brought up, the secret room in the back garden of Qingyu Hall fell silent. The faces of the people around the round table showed uneasy expressions. Summoning the old members of the Yi family had always been a risky matter, so Fan Xian was only going to make the first move. Moreover, he was using the excuse of inviting a teacher for Fan Xixia so that not many people would notice. After all, he didn't know how long it would be before he actually took over the palace treasury. Before he took over, he had to first prove that he had the ability to do so, and before that, he had to meet the emperor's definition. The emperor's definition of accepting a member of the palace treasury was simple. Whoever married Lin Wana would have the palace treasury. Although he didn't know why his uncle loved his fiancée so much, since Fan Xian had chosen to accept this marriage, he naturally chose to accept this challenge. Before the wedding, he first had to face another kind of challenge. The functionary of Taichung Temple had always been a nominal position, similar to an honorary title in a certain world. It was used to give the future son-in-law a more elegant position. Although it was only an 8th-level official, it was noble enough. At first, the custom of the kingdom of Qing was to make a 6th-level official of the Tongwen school. But later it was discovered that many son-in-law couldn't even memorize a poem, so the custom was changed to a functionary. In the previous dynasty, the functionary was known as a functionary, and was in charge of the rhythm of the ancestral temple. The royal family always thought that the son-in-law couldn't compose poems, and that they could only hum a few tunes, so it was decided. Although it was a nominal position, he still had to report to Taichung Temple. So early that morning, Fan Xian sat in his family's carriage with a worried face and hurried to Taichung Temple. At the temple gate, a 4th-level official of Taichung Temple was already there to greet him. Fan Xian was flattered by this display, and hurriedly went down to greet him. After exchanging pleasantries with his colleagues at Taichung Temple, he entered the yamen and sat in a small room, listening to the official explain what he should do. This official had been personally promoted by the Prime Minister, so it was easy to explain why he was so cordial to Fan Xian. But the official, as well as many officials in the court, still didn't understand why the illegitimate daughter of the Prime Minister was marrying the illegitimate son of the Fan family, and why everything was done according to the rules of the palace. Perhaps His Majesty was too fond of the Lin and Fan families, but in the eyes of many officials, His Majesty was too mischievous. And those who knew the true identity of the young lady of the Lin family wouldn't say anything. Fan Xian thought he was tone-deaf and couldn't avoid making a fool of himself. He didn't know that after sitting there for a whole morning and drinking a belly full of warm tea, he found that most of his colleagues were the same, only reading the newspaper issued by the palace. His stomach was bloated from drinking too much tea. He sighed, took a newspaper and entered the latrine. The newspaper was still full of gossip, but now that Qin Pingping had returned to the capital, the palace no longer dared to fabricate stories about the director's first love. Holding up his pants and coming out of the latrine, he unconsciously stuffed the newspaper deep into his underwear. Only then did he come to his senses and laugh. This was a habit he had developed in Danzhou years ago, and all the money he had saved up had been plundered this way. Just as he was about to go back to drinking tea, he suddenly heard a burst of exclamations from the room. Victory! Victory! God bless the Qin kingdom! Fan Xian's heart trembled. He knew that the struggle between the imperial court and northern Qi had ended with the imperial court's victory. After this small-scale battle between the puppet kingdoms, it was likely that more land in the north would be included in the kingdom of Qing's sphere of influence. Chapter 112. Inside the room, the officials were gathered together, reading the court bulletin, which clearly described everything that had happened in the north. Whether in terms of timeliness or richness of information, it was far more attractive than the newspaper published by the palace, especially since it contained news of the kingdom of Qing's victory. Fan Xian smiled wryly as he took out the crumpled newspaper from his bosom. He apologized to the great calligrapher Pan Ling of the Library of Documents, then sat back down at his table and began to drink his tea. The people around him were talking excitedly about the war, and no one noticed his silence. Instead, it was the vice minister who looked at him and smiled, motioning for him to come out. Fan Xian walked out, somewhat uneasy, and arrived at a secluded spot. This was already deep in the courtyard, where there was a stone table and 2 stone chairs. The vice minister motioned for him to sit down, then smiled. Everyone is celebrating, but you sit alone in silence. What? The vice minister's name was Ren Shaoan. He had once been a distinguished man, and had later married a princess. Since then he had steadily climbed up the ranks in Taichung Temple. It was somewhat similar to the situation Fan Xian was facing today. Fan Xian wasn't sure whether or not Sir Ren was grieving over something, and so he didn't know how to respond. All he could do was smile faintly. The royal court's victory is a matter of course, so it's not a surprise. Why is it a matter of course? Ren Xiao asked curiously. Fan Xian really didn't have much to say about military affairs, so he could only evade. His Majesty is wise and his soldiers are loyal. Northern Qi has a guilty conscience, so naturally they won. Ren Shaoan smiled at him. I just remembered that the war between the 2 countries has something to do with the assassination attempt, Sir Fan. Fan Xian was startled. He also remembered that one of the excuses the kingdom of Qing used to defend Qi and aid Zhao was that assassins from northern Qi had infiltrated the capital, intending to murder the son of a minister. Thinking of the corpses along the banks of the northern border, and the empty women of the various provinces and prefectures, Fan Xian didn't know why, but he felt a little stifled. He sighed. Soldiers are weapons of murder. Saints have no choice but to use them. He knew that although the kingdom of Qing had been at peace for more than a decade, the martial spirit in its bones had not faded, so he was very careful to hide it. But in front of Ren Xiaoqing he thought it was just a casual chat, so he spoke casually. Ren Xiaoqing seemed to appreciate his words and nodded his head. Even so, we have gained a lot of land this time. The kingdom of Qing will have a few more years of peace. It is worth it. Fan Xian was not a pedantic pacifist. He smiled and acknowledged this fact. Ren Xiaoqing continued, although all the military achievements will go to His Majesty, the imperial court has been secretly planning for this for 2 months. Can be said that they have racked their brains. Fan Xian immediately sensed something else from these words. He knew that the vice minister was saying that the civil service in the court had also contributed a great deal to the war. After all, Fan Xian had 2 lifetimes of experience. He knew that in the end, fighting a war was a battle of logistics, so he sincerely said, the great officials of the court also deserve great credit. Ren Xiaoqing smiled in satisfaction and continued, the Prime Minister and you are about to become father and son-in-law. If you have the time, it would be more appropriate for you to pay a visit to him. Of course. Thank you, Vice Minister, for the reminder. Fan Xian felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. He was about to marry Wan'er, but he had not yet paid a visit to his future father-in-law. This was somewhat inexcusable. But this was supposed to be an open relationship between the Lin Manor and the Fan Manor. Why would Ren Xiaoqing tell him this in private? As expected, Ren Xiaoqing said quietly, Teacher hopes that you will go to the Prime Minister's manor alone. He does not want to alarm too many people. Fan Xian accepted the order fearfully. The next day the court was filled with flattering words. The military received many rewards, and the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council was also rewarded by an imperial edict for their intelligence. But to everyone's surprise, Count Sinan, the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Revenue, Fan Jian, stepped forward and said that this victory was all thanks to the Prime Minister's racking his brains. He had prioritized the affairs of the state before the affairs of his family. He had smoothed out the logistics and had provided them with sufficient provisions. The officials were in an uproar. They did not understand why their political enemies were so harmonious today. But when they thought about the marriage between the 2 families, they suddenly understood. What was even more unexpected was that Guiyu, the Minister of Rights, who had always been on the Prime Minister's side, spoke out against it. Most unexpected of all. Qin Pingping went to court. When His Majesty asked him about it, he sat in his wheelchair and softly said, the Prime Minister has worked hard. At this point, the political enemies who had been attacking the Prime Minister over the collusion between Wu Bowen and Northern Qi suddenly quieted down. His Majesty had issued an imperial edict to comfort him, and Lin Ruofu had regained his footing. And there was a rumor in the court that the prime minister, because of the marriage alliance with the Fan family, had turned to the second prince. The second prince, who had originally had no support in the court, had suddenly become a powerful figure. No one knew that behind all this, the depressed Ren Shaoqing of Taichung Temple and the 8th-level functionary of Taichung Temple were chatting under the courtyard wall. Through Fan Xian he had sold his father-in-law a favor. This time he felt a little more secure. Although he was still afraid that the prime minister would find out that he had ordered people to kill the second young master Lin, he did not have to hide like he had for the past 2 months. He did not have to go to Taichung Temple every day. He only had to go to the temple once every 10 days. That afternoon, Fan Xian rode in a carriage to the royal courtyard. Now that his marriage to the girl in the courtyard was known throughout the capital, and with Fan Manor's generosity, the guards in charge had begun to turn a blind eye. Fan Xian and his sister walked in together. They were not in the mood to look at the wild flowers and weeds in the garden. They just followed the gravel path to the small building. Fan Ruoruo was a little surprised. "Brother, you seem to be familiar with this place." Fan Xian smiled. "I have a good memory. It's not like you don't know that." But in his heart he laughed. Over the course of 10 days he would go in and out of the garden 2 or 3 nights a day. It was difficult not to be familiar with it. Unfortunately, according to the rules, he, the future son-in-law of the princess, still could not see Lin Wanner in the courtyard. He could only sit downstairs and drink tea while Ruoruo went up alone. He was in no hurry. After all, he could see his fiancée every night, so there was no hurry. After a while, 2 people came down. Seeing the girl behind Ruoruo, Fan Xian's eyes brightened. The girl's eyes were clear and bright, and her eyebrows were a little thick, but she did not seem rude. On the contrary, she was very spirited. It was Yi Linger, the only daughter of the commander of the capital's garrison, Yi Zhong. Yi Linger saw a strange man waiting downstairs and felt a little strange. Fan Xian smiled and rose to greet her. "Miss Yi, long time no see." As soon as the words left his mouth, Fan Xian knew that something was wrong. When he had met Yi Linger that day, he had put on makeup and assumed the identity of a doctor. Today, however, he had clearly come to the courtyard to visit. If he said, "Long time no see," he was afraid that Yi Linger would become suspicious. To his surprise, Yi Linger only looked at him coolly and bowed. "Greetings, Master Fan." Seeing that she knew who he was and was not surprised by what he had said earlier, Fan Xian knew that Wanner must have told this close friend about their relationship. He smiled and said, "Wanner is fortunate to have you as my companion. My sickbed is not so boring." "Fan Xian thanks you." Yi Linger's expression was cold. "Master Fan is too polite." Fan Xian saw that this woman didn't seem to like him, but he wasn't angry. He didn't think that just by relying on his pretty face, all the women in the world would have a natural liking for him, so he just smiled and bowed again. He turned to Ruoruo and said, "How did it go with the matter you asked?" Fan Ruoruo smiled. "That's what you're worried about," Sister Lin said. Fan Xian suddenly waved his hand and smiled. "Let's talk about our own family matters at home." Hearing this, Yi Linger flew into a rage. Fan Xian really was a narrow-minded person. The meaning of his words was too obvious. Did he mean that the matter between the Fan and Lin families did not need to involve Yi Linger? "Master Fan," she said angrily, "don't go too far in your words and actions." Fan Xian was taken aback. Where did this come from? Why did Miss Yi have such a bad temper? He felt inexplicably irritated. Ignoring her, he took his sister by the hand and walked out of the manor. Outside the courtyard, Yi Linger left the manor with the servant girls. Seeing Fan Xian holding Ruoruo's hand, she laughed coldly. Fan Xian did not understand. He held Ruoruo's cold hand and waited for the carriage to arrive. Ruoruo's expression became somewhat awkward. Indeed, there were not many siblings in the world who were as close to each other as they were, and Fan Xian did not often pay attention to such things. Seeing his sister's expression, Fan Xian finally understood. He wondered why that woman kept pestering him. The relationship between him and Ruoruo was like the bright moon and the cool breeze, so he was particularly angry. He turned to Yi Linger and frowned. "Miss Yi, is it because there are no adults at home to discipline you? Is that why you wander around the capital and Dingzhou every day?" Yi Linger had not expected that her unintentional sneer would provoke such a vicious verbal attack. "Who are you calling uneducated?" she shouted angrily. "Who said that?" Fan Xian smiled warmly. "I don't think anyone here has." Seeing him act like a scoundrel, Yi Linger became even more exasperated. "Then aren't you wandering around the capital every day? You're about to get married and yet you're still so indecent. I haven't seen you go to Taichung Temple many times. Is it because there are no adults at home to discipline you as well? Fan Xian's gentle temperament carried a hint of murderous intent, but he was even more mischievous. He knew that if he did not get angry she would get even angrier, so he spoke even more warmly. I've come to visit my fiancée and that's all right. Miss Yi and my Wana are good friends and you often visit. I have already thanked you. I just hope that you will watch your words and not try to drive a wedge between our families. Yi Linger was so angry that her lips twitched. Hearing him play this trick again she said hatefully, I don't know what Wana sees in you, you foppish playboy. Fan Xian sighed. How am I foppish? Yi Linger said hatefully, you're not good at literature and you're not good at martial arts. Are you saying that you're a foppish playboy? Fan Xian laughed, a little ashamed. I loathe boasting, he said. But people in the capital say that I'm skilled in both literature and martial arts, that I can compose a poem in 7 steps, and that I can kill in 7 steps. The praise makes me feel a little smug and today I've been enlightened by your words. I'm truly grateful. Seeing him act like this, Yi Linger remembered his reputation, and angrily stamped her foot. She didn't know what to say. Suddenly, she bit her rosy lips and put her hand on the knife at her waist. After some thought, she removed the knife and threw it on the ground in front of Fan Xian. It made a crisp sound. Chapter 113. Following the sound, the gate to the royal courtyard fell silent. Although the kingdom of Qing had enjoyed a long period of peace, and there were only small skirmishes on the northern frontier, it had only been a few decades since the founding of the kingdom, so the people were still valiant and courageous. As the daughter of a military family, it was normal for Yi Linger to have a small scimitar at her waist. But, to throw it in front of Fan Xian's feet was quite unusual. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows. He knew that this was an invitation to a duel, similar to the world he had lived in. When European nobles dueled, they liked to throw their gloves at each other's faces. He scratched the right side of his face, feeling a little itchy. Amused, he thought that if the duel rule in the kingdom of Qing was to throw the knife at the opponent's face, then every duel would be successful. Everyone looked at Fan Xian. Ruoro nervously tugged at Fan Xian's sleeve. Although Yi Linger's waist was slender and supple, she was a true 7th-level master. No foppish young master in the capital would dare to provoke her. But since she had thrown the knife and issued a challenge as a man, Fan Xian would appear cowardly if he did not accept the challenge. He was afraid that he would not be able to raise his head in the capital. Seeing that the two nobles were fighting fiercely, the guards at the gate of the side courtyard looked down and pretended not to hear anything. Naturally, no one would be so stupid as to tell the princess in the side courtyard, your best friend and the man you're about to marry are about to fight. Who would be so stupid? Since you claim to be a master of both the pen and the sword, I would like to see on behalf of Waner whether or not you have the ability to protect her. Strangely, ever since she had thrown down the knife, Yi Linger's entire state had undergone a miraculous change. She had calmed down, and her beautiful jade-like eyes were filled with confidence. Her small and weak body seemed to contain a vast power that she was about to unleash on Fan Xian. Fan Xian's heart trembled. Only now did he know that this girl was a powerful person who hid her strength deeply. However, on his face, he smiled slightly and waved his hand, saying 3 words that no one present expected. I refuse. Refuse the duel? This was a very rare thing. Refusing a woman's challenge would probably make Fan Xian unable to raise his head. No one understood why Fan Xian would make such a jaw-dropping choice. Fan Xian explained sincerely, although Miss Yi does not like me, you are still Waner's good friend. How could I have the heart to attack you? Without waiting for the crowd to cheer, he smiled and said, what's more, I don't want to hit women unless it's absolutely necessary. The carriage had arrived a long time ago, but seeing the tense situation, it had stopped outside. Wang Qinian saw that his opponent was Yi Linger, and could only worry helplessly. He did not dare to use his identity as an Overwatch Council member to pressure his opponent. Having said this, Fan Xian once again took his sister's little hand and walked towards the carriage in a show of force. A clear voice rang out furiously. Finally, Yi Linger could no longer endure Fan Xian's incessant barrage of insults. She exploded. Her silhouette blurred and she was already behind Fan Xian, her fist flying straight out. Fortunately, she still had some martial arts heritage and before she moved she had already given a warning. Feeling the violent wind behind him, Fan Xian's right hand cleverly exerted force and led his sister to the side. Immediately after he turned around. And then he saw a fist heading straight for his face. The fist was small and beautiful with fair skin. One could even see the faint blue veins on its surface. When it was clenched into a fist, only the thumb was exposed and it was painted with pink cardamom. To be able to see so many details in such a short amount of time only proved two things. First, Fan Xian was a man of many emotions and desires. Second, although Yi Linger's actions were violent and fast, compared to the elusive staff on the cliff in Danzhou, she was still much, much slower. The tip of his foot moved an inch from the ground, and his whole body moved with incredible speed to the left, causing the murderous fist to completely miss, which brushed past his cheek. There was a buzzing sound as the fist missed, but it still caused the wind to tremble, and the hair on Fan Xian's cheek floated up. At this moment, his right hand had already been raised without anyone noticing. His index finger bent slightly, and in the time it takes for a spark to fly off a flint, he flicked Yi Linger's pulse. Even Gong Dian, the deputy commander of the palace guards, could not dodge this move if he was caught off guard, let alone Yi Linger. All he heard was a light grunt, and her tightly clenched fist had already loosened, right next to Fan Xian's cheek. But Fan Xian had no time to be happy. His eyes narrowed and he strangely took 3 steps back. He stretched out his hand and clapped it 3 times in the air. Pok, pok, pok. 3 crisp sounds rang out next to him. As soon as Yi Linger's fist loosened, her 5 fingers opened up like peach branches in spring. Each finger was like an awe-inspiring branch, aiming for his temple. Fan Xian dodged completely by relying on his reflexes. He struck out 3 times, blocking the 5 streaks of air piercing through the air. The Yi family sans ho. The onlookers cried out in alarm. The great grandmaster Yi Luyun of the kingdom of Qing was Yi Linger's great-uncle. No one had expected this young lady to have received Yi Luyun's teachings. The cries of surprise did not stop. Fan Xian's face was calm as he rushed forward, and his fist landed squarely on Yi Linger's palm. There was a muffled sound, and whether Yi Linger's fingers were peach branches or something else, they were all broken. The powerful Jinqi in his palm had bluntly broken his opponent's sans ho. Yi Linger floated back half a foot, clutching her wrist in pain. She looked at Fan Xian in shock. She had never imagined that the Jinqi in Fan Xian's body would be so strange. After her palm had touched it, it had invaded her meridians. The pain made her mind scatter and she immediately lost the will to sans ho. You are no match for me. Fan Xian was still smiling, using words to provoke her. Yi Linger gritted her teeth and charged forward again. This time she was even more ferocious than before. Her 5 fingers formed a knife and she chopped down horizontally. The palm knife cut through the air with a whistling sound. She was a woman, and her innate Jinqi was not as abundant as that of an adult man. So when Yi Luyun had first taught her sans ho, he had put some thought into it. When faced with an expert whose Jinqi was stronger than hers, she would use her fingers as a palm, turning the will of the Sanshou's withered branches into the power to chop wood. Fan Xian felt a chill in his heart, but his body did not sway under the wind of the palm strikes. His feet were hurried, and he relied on the escaping skills he had learned on the cliffs in Danzhou to dodge each of Yi Linger's vertical palms with great skill. Perhaps it could be said that it was extremely dangerous. The wind from Yi Linger's palms grew fiercer and fiercer, and the spectators felt as if there was a cold wind blowing in all directions. It was as if there were countless knives dancing around Fan Xian, and he vaguely sensed danger. He grunted and the tyrannical Jinqi filled his body. He stomped heavily on the ground, and forcibly stopped himself from retreating. He exerted strength in his waist and abdomen, and his whole body felt as if someone had punched him from behind. He suddenly shot forward. From retreat to advance, there was no sign of stopping. The wind from the palm strike disappeared and so did Fan Xian. The next moment the spectators' mouths dropped open. Fan Xian had disappeared from Yi Linger's bosom. His 2 hands were like iron pincers around her armpits, and he lifted her terrifying palms and placed them on his shoulders. To be precise, before Yi Linger's 2 palms struck down, he had used a technique similar to holding her in his arms to grab her vitals. Fan Xian's trick seemed shameless, but in reality he was trying to find the only way to get close to her in the midst of the wind from the palm strikes. Furthermore, it was only a very small space in the blink of an eye. His speed and eyesight had already reached a terrifying level. Of course, this was all thanks to Wu Zhu's teachings. Yi Linger suddenly realized that Fan Xian was falling toward her like a ghost, and then he was hugging her. She frowned. She knew that for him to be able to get close to her body, he had to have some kind of eyesight technique. She was shocked but not panicked. Her palms stopped moving and her whole body rose into the air. Without any warning, she kicked toward Fan Xian's shin. If this kick landed, Fan Xian would probably fall on top of her in pain. However, at this moment she couldn't care too much. Just then Fan Xian let go of her hands, letting her unfinished palm strike fall freely. The structure of the human body was strange. If your palms were chopping down, it would be very difficult for your legs to kick up. Fan Xian needed a moment of discomfort from his opponent. Taking advantage of this brief moment, he had already rushed forward with his fist. This was Fan Xian's third punch in the capital, after the murder on Yulon Street. Each of his punches had broken a person's nose, and today was no exception. There was a soft sound and a beautiful flower of blood floated in the air, giving off a romantic feeling. Yi Linger covered her nose and squatted down. There was blood between her fingers. After a moment she began to cry out in pain. Fan Xian was speechless. "If you want to fight, I'll fight with you. How can you cry when you lose?" The servants of the Yi Manor had long since surrounded her, but they were well behaved and did not swarm her. It seemed that it was common for Miss Yi to fight someone, but there were still many people who stared at Fan Xian. Fan Xian confidently brushed his robes without any misgivings. But the royal guards who were watching from a distance lowered their voices and sighed. "Miss Ye's family is well educated, but I didn't expect her to be hit by Fan Xian's black fist." Seeing Miss Yi squatting on the ground and crying, Fan Xian remembered that she was only a 15-year-old girl. But he didn't feel any guilt. Not hitting women didn't mean he was willing to be hit. When his mother had first entered the capital, she had beaten this girl's father, the current commander of the capital garrison Yi Zhong, into a pig's head. His own uncle Wu Zhu had once fought with Yi Luyun under the palace walls, forcing the grandmaster of the kingdom of Qing to go into seclusion for several months, forsaking his sword and taking up Sanzhou. Him hitting Yi Linger could be considered a continuation of this glorious tradition. Chapter 114. Given Fan Xian's temperament after the fight, he would have hurried home to find his mother. But he had never expected Ruoruo to glare at him. It seemed that his sister thought he had been too heavy-handed. He could only smile bitterly and shake his head, watching as she took out a handkerchief to wipe the blood from Yi Linger's nose. Yi Linger's nose is pretty, but it's a pity she looks like a snot-nosed child. Yi Zhong's family name is Yi, and so is my mother. Was it because of this that we never liked each other? Now Yi Linger and I don't like each other either. It looks like it's the legacy of our elders. Fan Xian was actually a very calm person, but the situation was awkward and it was not convenient for him to leave, so he could only think of such things to hide his emotions. After a long time, the weeping Yi Linger finally calmed down under Ruoruo's comforting words. When she looked at Fan Xian again, there was not only hatred in her eyes, but also respect. She was, after all, a daughter of the Yi family. She was not as skilled as Fan Xian, but she would not argue. She struggled to bow to Fan Xian, acknowledging her defeat. Seeing that his opponent was straightforward, Fan Xian felt a little embarrassed. He coughed and asked casually, "What palm technique did you use just now?" "Coffin breaker." Yi Linger sniffled and stubbornly replied, "I admit defeat, but that is only because I am not skilled enough. It has nothing to do with the martial arts of the Yi family." Fan Xian finally felt that there was something cute about this girl. He laughed. "Coffin breaker is a good name. It seems to be a simplified version of Luyin Sanzhou. It is not easy for you to have such a level of martial cultivation." The sedan chair had to be carried by people in the front, and people in the back had to carry it as well. So Yi Linger covered her bleeding nose and snorted. "What move did you use?" she asked. Everyone in the Yi family was obsessed with martial arts. Yi Linger was in no hurry to get back at Fan Xian. Instead, she was anxious to find out what kind of strange and unimaginable method her opponent had used. The people of Qing loved martial arts, but no one had ever been like Fan Xian. He had only relied on his jinqi, speed and judgment to strike first. He had relied on his understanding of the human body structure to attack the parts of the enemy that he had never paid attention to. Every little bit made a mickle. Yi Linger had never seen such a method before, but her granduncle had. Fan Xian was taken aback. His black fist didn't seem to be much of a technique, so he said, "It's just a small trick. Miss Yi, please go and treat your wounds." These techniques were the killing techniques that Wu Zhu had taught him, the techniques of identifying people that Fei Jie had taught him, and the insights he had gained from using them for the first time on Yulon Street. Fan Xian called this a little trick, and it was indeed like the name. Later, Fan Xian's little tricks became famous in Jingdo. It became a name that could be included in a book on the martial path. This was something Fan Xian could not imagine at this time. Otherwise, he would certainly have named it something like Danzhou's plum-breaking hand, or Sinan's 6 young palms. But today his little tricks had won against the great coffin breaker. Although this sort of sparring in Jingdo was mostly carried out in the manors, it was nothing new, so the Fan and Yi manors did not do anything. Yi Ling'er, who had admitted defeat, left resentfully. But before she left, she insisted on handing the curved knife at her waist to Fan Xian, saying that it was a prize for admitting defeat. Sitting in the carriage, Fan Xian smiled bitterly as he played with the prize in his hand. He thought that fighting a young girl for no reason might even offend the Yi manor. Fan Ruoruo seemed to have guessed what he was thinking. She smiled and said, "It doesn't matter. The children of the Yi manor love martial arts and everyone knows that. Otherwise they would not have produced a grandmaster. Yi Zhong is a man of integrity, and will not get angry over such a small matter." Fan Xian sighed. "It's not entirely because of this matter. I just think it's ridiculous." Fan Ruoruo laughed. "Earlier you refused to duel with her. That was quite surprising." "Surprising? Are you worried that the people of the capital will think I'm a coward? You said before that she is only a 7th level ace, and I am a strange scholar who has even killed an 8th level ace. Even if I don't fight her, will the people of the capital think I'm afraid of her?" Fan Xian smiled. "Although it is said that swords are more powerful than words, if words alone are enough to humiliate an opponent, then there is no need to resort to swords." Having said this, he suddenly slapped his thigh and said in annoyance, "Fine, we've already fought. There's no point in talking about this." Fan Ruoruo giggled. Fan Xian asked curiously, "Why does Miss Yi always dislike me?" "I don't know." Fan Ruoruo thought for a moment, then replied, "She probably thought that it was a very sad thing for sister-in-law to marry you. Later, although this problem didn't exist, we lied to her again. It was equivalent to using her help to let you see sister-in-law. She couldn't take this lying down." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "I knew it. There are no secrets between friends. The key is Surfei's student." Fan Ruoruo continued to explain. "Last time my brother used this name. Now it seems that many people know that our family has a good relationship with Sir Chin of the Overwatch Council. Perhaps it was because of this that they let the cat out of the bag." Fan Xian's heart trembled. He didn't want others to guess anything from this, did they? But then he thought about how many years ago the Yi family had been in the capital. Based on what he saw in front of him, it seemed that the people of the capital had long forgotten what had happened. Fan Ruoruo handed him a piece of paper. He took it and looked at it carefully, then crumpled it into a ball and threw it out the window. On the paper were a few sentences written by one. His main purpose in coming to the manor today was to discuss with his fiancée what he should bring up when he was about to visit his father-in-law. Although Lin Wan-er hadn't lived with the Prime Minister since they were young, they were still father and daughter. She knew better than an outsider like Fan Xian. The next day the sky darkened. Dark clouds hung over the city, slightly reducing the heat of the sun. But it made the capital feel even more like a steamer basket. Fan Xian wiped his sweat and crouched on the edge of Jiazhu Street, carefully picking through the goods on the stall. Jiazhu Street was the distribution center for antiques and playthings in the capital. People who were interested in these things, whenever the weather was good, liked to come to this street to look around. Fan Xian imitated the actions of an expert. One foot on the shoulder of the road, the other on the edge of the stall's vellum. His fingers moved about randomly on the stall. More than an hour had passed, but there was no final result. The stall owner was a little anxious. But seeing that Fan Xian was dressed like a rich man, he couldn't say much. All he could do was smile. "Sir, what goods are you looking for?" "Snuff bottles." Fan Xian opened his mouth helplessly. Wan-er had said that the Prime Minister's favorite hobby was playing with snuff bottles, so he had hoped to find something good today. He hadn't expected that his eyes would be dazzled, and he still hadn't seen anything that caught his eye. "Well, you found the right place." The stall owner's eyes lit up and he said, "I have blue and white glaze, jadeite, amber, whatever you want. Especially the jadeite." "Very good. Look at this." He picked up a small pot. The color of the pot was green and slightly yellow. "See? It's yellow poplar green. Although it's not very old, the quality and workmanship are excellent." "Do you have emerald?" Fan Xian thought that he had to pick the most expensive one. The stall owner said awkwardly, "Emerald is too precious. It's used to make snuff bottles. That's a standard only available in the palace. Although we don't really need it these days, if you want to find an emerald snuff bottle on Jiazhu Street, it'll be a little difficult." The stall owner was a very good person. He pointed Fan Xian to a large shop on the street, saying that if he wanted to find an emerald snuff bottle, he had to go there. Fan Xian thanked him, put down a piece of silver and picked up a piece of porcelain which he wasn't sure was real or fake. Then he got up and left. Wang Qinian watched from the side and a smile rose on his face. He thought that Fan Xian was very gentle to peddlers and commoners, and most importantly he was very meticulous. Entering the large shop, Fan Xian was greeted by a gust of wind. When he looked closely he saw that it was a fan that was constantly moving. Fan Xian was very impressed. He wasn't in a hurry to ask about the snuff bottle. First he grabbed the stall owner and asked who sold the fan. After asking he found out that it was a new product that had come out last year. The stall owner had some friendship with the merchant, so he put it in the lobby as a living advertisement. After asking for the merchant's address, Fan Xian began to ask about the snuff bottle. The stall owner looked Fan Xian up and down. From his clothes he confirmed the value of Fan Xian's wallet. Only then did he go into the back room and carefully take out a box. He placed it on the table and opened it. The box was covered with red brocade, and extremely soft materials supported the snuff bottles of all kinds of materials to prevent them from breaking. The stall owner didn't say much. He simply asked, "Do you want the best or do you want the best?" Fan Xian liked this feeling. He smiled. "Of course the best." Hearing this, the stall owner closed the box and felt around his waist for a long time. Then he took out a light green jade bottle. The material was green and smooth without a trace of flocculation. It was a high-quality material. Inside there was a painting of a fisherman sitting alone by a cold river. Not only was the artistic conception high, but the brushwork was also slender and soft. The craftsmanship was extremely rare. "Name your price." Fan Xian took it and played with it in his palm. It felt warm and smooth and it felt very good. It was a little itchy, a little smooth and a little moist. 2,000 taels of silver. The stall owner's face was expressionless. It seemed that he was very annoyed by people coming to buy things. He seemed a little cold and indifferent, which actually piqued Fan Xian's interest. The goods were indeed good. The style of an old shop was indeed different. He thought about it. The money he had saved in Danzhou plus the money his sister had given him, had all been given to his brother to open a bookstore. Danbo bookstore's business was booming, but the money he had saved up had not yet been returned to him. Later he had borrowed 2,000 taels of silver from Teng Zijing. Subtracting the 400 taels he had spent on the pleasure boat, he had used them a lot lately. He still had about 1,300 taels of silver left. He frowned. 800 taels. Chapter 115. Fan Xian didn't know how to bargain, but in his previous life, that beautiful nurse often chatted with him and told him that when girls bought clothes, they would bargain from a third. Fan Xian wasn't as smart as the young girl, so he cut the price by 2/5. But the shopkeeper glared at him as if annoyed at this young man's lack of knowledge. He coldly closed the box and prepared to take it back to his room. Fan Xian panicked and opened his mouth to call him back so they could discuss the price. Unexpectedly, Wang Qinian, who had been silent all this time, gave Fan Xian a meaningful look. Fan Xian followed him out suspiciously. "It's only worth 400 taels. Wang Qinian respectfully said to him, "Sir, let me ask." Having said this, he walked back into the shop without a signboard. After a while he came out again, this time with a verdant snuff bottle in his hand. Then he took the 400 taels of silver from Fan Xian and handed it to the shopkeeper, whose face was ashen. Once in the carriage, Fan Xian quietly said, "Don't use your position to bully the good people." He touched the snuff bottle in his belt and couldn't help but laugh. "But it's not bad to bully these profiteers once in a while." Wang Qinian smiled. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes bloomed like chrysanthemums. After all, he was a man in his 40s. He carefully explained, "He's not a profiteer. It's just that this snuff bottle only costs 300 taels at most. We're not bullying him by offering 400 taels." Fan Xian looked at Wang Qinian in surprise. Could it be that Sir Wang is well versed in antiques? How else could you tell the real price at a glance? You should know that there's a lot of foam in this trade. Wang Qinian laughed again. "Sir, have you forgotten what I did for a living before I was admitted to the academy?" Fan Xian suddenly understood. He laughed out loud and said, "So, when you were a lone thief you learned this knowledge along the way." Wang Qinian was embarrassed. "I was peddling in those small kingdoms by myself. I didn't dare ask for help, so I had to sharpen my eyes." With such an expert in the antique world, it was no wonder that he could cut down the price of the snuff bottle so easily. Returning to the main gate of the Fan Manor, Wang Qinian's small group withdrew, leaving the Fan Manor's own defense forces to handle. At the same time, the fans that Fan Xian had ordered from another shop arrived at the front door. The servants hurriedly took them in, but when it came time to pay the bill, the cashier said to Fan Xian with a pained expression, "Although these fans are good, they are too expensive. Young master, you bought 5 of them at once. It will be difficult for me to report to the second wife." At that moment, Lady Lu had just walked into the accounts room. Hearing what the accountant had said, she looked at Fan Xian with a smile that was not quite a smile. She nodded and said, "Enter the account." Fan Xian smiled and saluted his aunt. "Hello, aunt." The current situation between the two of them was too awkward. They couldn't be considered close, and their hatred had yet to erupt into hostility. Fan Xian was a bit puzzled about something. He frowned and asked, "Aunt, I think this fan is cool and comfortable to put in the hall. But why haven't I seen anyone else using it?" Madame Lu smiled and shook her head. "Regarding this matter, you will understand it better than anyone else in the future. It's all because the price of that shop is too high that no one is willing to buy it. Summer is only a few days away, so even if we dig an ice house, it won't be much more expensive than that fan." Fan Xian was quick-witted and understood immediately. "This is the palace treasury's business?" Lady Lu nodded. Fan Xian sighed. "How could it be so expensive? Any peddler could learn this craft. Why aren't there others selling it?" Lady Lu smiled. "Although no one says it openly, everyone knows that this is the emperor selling the palace treasury's business. Who would dare to copy it? The Overwatch Council can just give it a name, and it's a crime punishable by imprisonment or exile." Fan Xian shook his head, feeling that something was wrong. Lady Lu asked curiously, "Why did you buy 5 of them all at once?" Fan Xian explained gently, "One in the flower pavilion, one in my father's and aunt's room, and the other 3 are to be given away. One to King Jing's manor, one to the Prime Minister's manor, and one to the Duke's manor." Lady Lu's paternal family was also a large one in the capital. Within 3 generations there had been a duke, so whenever the duke's manor was mentioned in the Fan manor, it was the Lu family, Lu Heng, the Duke of Hongyi. Lady Lu was a little surprised. She hadn't expected this handsome young man to be so thoughtful, and she hadn't expected him to take the initiative to show her goodwill. For a moment she didn't know how to respond. She smiled absent-mindedly and left the accounting room. In fact, after seeing Lady Lu, Fan Xian had occasionally thought of returning the relationship between him and Lady Lu. If he wanted Fan Xizha to stand firmly by his side in the future, and to avoid the family fights that he disliked, then he had to ensure that Lady Lu wouldn't do anything. That would make it impossible for the two sides to reconcile. Small favors and small gifts naturally wouldn't have that kind of effect, so he had to take things one step at a time. Fan Xian was confident that Lady Lu's heart was divided into 3 parts. One belonged to Count Sinan, Fan Jian, and the other to Fan Xizha. As long as they could mutually benefit from each other, Lady Lu shouldn't have too many objections. As for the assassination attempt when he was 12, Fan Xian frowned and forced himself to control his emotions. He convinced himself that the Empress and the eldest princess were his true enemies. In the Prime Minister's manner, Lin Ruofu gently stroked the snuff bottle in his hand. "This is polished from the finest emerald," he said softly. "The stopper is very clever. Although it's painted on the inside and the work is good, it seems a little redundant." Yuan Hongdao listened to the side. He knew that the Prime Minister was referring to something. He smiled. A new son-in-law pays his respects to his father-in-law. It's only right that he brings some gifts. Lin Ruofu smiled and stood up. With one hand he opened the scroll on the table. It turned out to be a painting of an old man fishing alone by the river. The river flowed without end, and the entire painting was covered in ice and snow. Next to the painting was a poem. 1,000 mountains of birds fly, 10,000 paths of people disappear. An old man with a straw hat on a lonely boat, fishing alone by the cold river. Lin Ruofu softly recited the poem on the painting and sighed. Although the painting is ordinary and the calligraphy isn't extraordinary, this poem is good. I've always heard that Fan Xian was famous for his poems, and it seems so. But with this poem, do you still think that he only brought the proper meaning between a father-in-law and son-in-law? Yuan Hongdao smiled bitterly. He thought that this young master Fan was really strange. He knew that the old man had just lost his son, and that his heart had not yet calmed down, and yet he had brought such a sad poem and painting. After a moment's thought, his eyes brightened. "Sir, look here." He pointed to a spot in the painting. That spot of white ink was right beside the mountain peak. On the side of the cliff, one could faintly see 2 extremely thin and light ink lines in the snow, swaying and swaying, like a stalk of grass struggling to straighten its back in the snow. "This is?" This is a dot of green on the snowy cliff of the cold river, Yuan Hongdao explained with a smile. Lin Ruofu looked at the extremely difficult to find grass in the painting, and his expression gradually softened. It seems that even you like this young man called Fan Xian. Yuan Hongdao was not afraid of anything. He smiled. Young Master Fan comes from a good family, is talented, and has an excellent temperament. From what you say, he sounds like a perfect person. Lin Ruofu smiled and shook his head. If Chen can be happy when she marries him, then of course that's good. Suddenly he lowered his voice. But about that matter, are you really sure? Yuan Hongdao answered very seriously. The matter at the foot of the Tsang Mountains has already been confirmed. I heard that Fei Jie is currently negotiating with Dongyi. Yes. Lin Ruofu half closed his eyes. I think so too. In truth, I don't care about Fan Xian's talent or family background. I only care about his temperament and methods. As long as his temperament is good and his methods are ruthless after I die, if he can protect the Lin family and my only son and daughter, then that's good enough. After Lin Gong's death, the Prime Minister was actually somewhat disheartened. His eldest son was an idiot, and he couldn't see his daughter for many years. But he still had to think about his officials and his clansmen, so the kind of person Lin Wan'er would marry was the most important thing in his mind. How is it outside? Lin Ruofu asked with a gentle expression. Very good. It's even better than what you and I had imagined. Why is the sky blue? Because the sea is blue. Why is the sea blue? Because when light enters the sea, it turns blue. Don't listen to me. I don't know much about these things. I'm basically just talking nonsense. Why is the water in the pond clear and not blue? Because the water in the pond is shallow. Huh? In the garden, Lin Wan'er's eldest brother sat on a rattan chair. His fat body seemed to take up the entire chair. He asked Fan Xian curiously. His eyes were pure and innocent like a child's, but his eyes occasionally showed a bit of dullness. Fan Xian knew that the eldest son of the Prime Minister's manor wasn't in good health, but he didn't realize that Wan'er's eldest brother was actually an idiot. For some reason the Prime Minister didn't want to see him. Fan Xian stayed in the back garden, but coincidentally ran into his brother-in-law, so he could only chat with him. He smiled and thought to himself, I wonder if this chubby idiot would occasionally get angry and beat me up. What's your name? Fan Xian smiled as he looked at his idiotic brother-in-law. After chatting for a while, he realized that his reaction was actually a bit slow, like a child a few years old. He was a bit adorable, at least more adorable than the accountant Fan Xizha. His brother-in-law pursed his lips, making his chubby cheeks look even rounder. 2 wrinkles appeared on the sides of his lips. My name is De Bao. My brother is called Air Bao. Air Bao hasn't been home for a long time. Fan Xian's heart trembled. He thought of the dead Lin Gong. In the blink of an eye, he looked at his idiotic brother-in-law in front of him, not knowing what to say. Chapter 116. If an average adult were to chat with an idiot who only had a few years of intelligence, it would be easy to get annoyed. But Fan Xian was different. In the last years of Fan Xian's previous life, he had been bedridden and unable to move. In this life, when he practiced that strange tyrannical martial method, he often fell into a semi-vegetative state. Thus, his patience was excellent. In addition, he felt pity for this retarded brother-in-law in front of him called De Bao, so he was able to control his temper and smile as he chatted with De Bao. In Fan Xian's mind, this slow-moving, fat man next to him was much more adorable and trustworthy than anyone else in the capital. I say, big brother, why is De Bao so fat and you so thin? De Bao frowned as if troubled by this question. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. First of all, you are my big brother and I will be your brother-in-law. Second, I'm not thin, it's just that De Bao is a bit fat. De Bao shook his head and yawned. He picked up a piece of Jiangnan cake from the table next to him and put it in his mouth. He chewed vigorously and spoke with a lisp. De Bao is not fat, I just like to eat. Seeing that the Prime Minister had no intention of passing on his message, Fan Xian rolled his eyes and moved closer to his brother-in-law's ear. De Bao, when will I take you out to play? Play? Play what? De Bao said happily. I want to play polo. Huh? Fan Xian felt a headache coming on, thinking that he had given himself something to do. He had wanted to take his brother-in-law out for the summer, and then use it as an excuse to drag Wan'er out of the heavily guarded royal courtyard. How could he have known that his fat brother-in-law wanted to play polo? He quickly changed his mind and said, De Bao, do you want to hear a story? De Bao's nostrils flared and he took 2 deep breaths. Good. he said excitedly. Debao loves stories. Thus, in the garden of the Prime Minister's house, a refreshing voice began to speak. This voice was telling a story. The story was about a beautiful Snow White and 7 dwarves living happily in a forest. One day Snow White went to pick small mushrooms. This is unexpected. Prime Minister Lin Ruofu looked out the window and smiled. Do you think he's faking it? Yuan Hongdao shook his head. It doesn't seem like it. Master Fan's smile is extremely sincere. It must be from the bottom of his heart. Lin Ruofu sighed. Invite him in. Fan Xian had been nervous ever since he entered the Prime Minister's private residence. When he entered the Prime Minister's private study and saw his future father-in-law's face for the first time, he couldn't help but tremble a little. After all, the death of the Prime Minister's only normal son had something to do with him. However, he still maintained a respectful and cautious expression on his face and was abnormally calm. Greetings, Uncle Lin. Addressing Fan Xian was a very particular matter. Calling him Prime Minister was certainly not appropriate, and calling him Sir Fan was not beautiful either. Calling him uncle would not only strengthen the relationship between the Fan family and the Lin family, but also faintly show the closeness that the marriage would bring. Lin Ruofu looked at Fan Xian's calm face and was satisfied with his performance. After a moment's deliberation, he said, I believe that Master Fan understands why I have invited you here today. Fan Xian hurriedly replied with a smile, Uncle, please call me by my name. Lin Ruofu nodded. Fan Xian, do you have any objections to this marriage? Fan Xian thought to himself, what objections could he possibly have? He couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. Seeing his expression, Lin Ruofu felt even more at ease. He smiled. As you can see, after Gong passes away, I only have one son and one daughter. Chen is to be married to you. You must treat her well. Fan Xian lowered his head and replied in a low voice without any hesitation. The older generation will pass away one day. Lin Ruofu suddenly spoke in a clear voice. If I were to be presumptuous and say that one day in the future, I entrust my son to you, would you be able to bear the responsibility? Fan Xian thought for a moment, then stood up. He cupped his fists and bowed. Of course. In the future we will be considered one family, so there are some things that I can say in front of you. Lin Ruofu looked into the young man's eyes, as if he wanted to see into the depths of his heart. Although Wan and I rarely see each other, she is still my daughter. Her surname is Lin, so we must consider the interests of the Lin family. Once the marriage is over, I believe Count Sinan will understand that our two families will share the same life and glory. I hope that in the future, whether in court or in the wilderness, you will firmly remember your position. From now on, you will not only protect the Fan family but also the interests of the Lin family. His words were blunt, but it was the only way to show that the Prime Minister had finally given his approval to the marriage. Fan Xian felt a surge of joy in his heart. Although marrying Wan was a matter handled by the palace, to have his father-in-law's approval would naturally make it more legitimate. But thinking about the other meaning behind these words, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a headache coming on. This father-in-law, whom he had just met, had clearly abandoned the Eastern Palace, but he didn't know if he was preparing to lean on the side of the second prince. Everyone knew that Fan Manor and King Jing's Manor were the second prince's supporters, but Fan Xian knew that his father's thoughts were much more complicated. After the successful trip to the Prime Minister's manor, Lin Wan finally found an opportunity to enter the palace. She showed her filial piety to the Empress Dowager for half a day, and somehow managed to persuade her uncle, who was usually stone-faced, to receive an edict. She was finally able to leave the royal courtyard and go for a stroll. Under the careful care of Fan Xian and the royal doctors, Lin Wan's recovery was excellent. She could already go out for a walk. Although the root of her illness had not been cured, it was not a good idea to hide in the small building all the time. So when he heard that the palace had finally lifted the ban, Fan Xian was overjoyed. Early the next morning, he took his carriage and all the things he had prepared and rushed to the royal courtyard to wait. After some time, the courtyard finally became lively. First, a few guards led the way, then a few old nannies led the way, and a few pretty maids led the way. Finally, Lin Wan leisurely walked out with the support of the head maid, Siki. Lin Wan wore a refreshing white dress and a bamboo hat on her head. This kind of hat was extremely light, and under the hat was a thin layer of gauze. It blocked the sunlight and also covered her beautiful face. Only the faint smile on her face and lips could be seen. Fan Xian went forward to greet them, but the old nannies became nervous when they saw this new son-in-law. They stood in front of the princess like they were fighting a flood, and stared at him fiercely with eyes like lightning. Fan Xian was furious. He thought to himself, I'm in love and I have to be disturbed by you guys. If you really annoy me, I'll give you some laxatives. I'll glare at you until you can't leave the toilet. Lin Wana looked at him apologetically, but she pinched the servant girl next to her. Siki felt the pain and almost cried out. Who did she offend this time? But she understood what her mistress meant. She quickly went forward and said to the young master, Master Fan, let's split up. We'll meet again at the summer villa in the western part of the city. The summer villa was a royal summer garden, about 20 miles west of the capital. If Lin Wan hadn't come out today, Fan Xian wouldn't have been able to enjoy it. Fan Xian snorted, but he knew that if he sat in the same carriage with Lin Wan before the wedding, she would be embarrassed, and the old nannies would go crazy. So he didn't say anything more, but he gave Ruoruo a look. Ruoruo understood and smiled. She walked to her future sister-in-law's side and gently took Lin Wanner's hand. She said something and then followed the group of people from the villa into the palace carriage. Brother, being the son-in-law, is a very annoying thing. Fan Xizha looked at Fan Xian sympathetically. Autumn is coming, Fan Xian sighed. It shouldn't be a problem for your sister to follow sister-in-law. Those damned old nannies don't think lilies will bloom in carriages. What's a lily? It's a holy plant. The two of them left early just as the sky brightened. But by the time the carriages reached the summer villa, the sun had already woken up. It warmly shone on everything as if it were a comrade. Fortunately, the royal palace had already considered these problems. The pampered royal family all refused to accept the warmth of the sun, so the villa was built next to a dense forest. It was next to the mountains and looked out over the lake, sheltering it from the sun and welcoming the wind. The surface of the lake was calm, but the wind still blew gently, taking away the last bit of dryness in the forest. Fan Xian stood on the grass by the lake, looking at the scenery in front of him. He was full of admiration. The activities of the emperor's farmhouse were indeed different. Their living conditions were much better than those of the common officials. When they entered the summer villa, Ruoruo somehow managed to persuade the royal guards to leave the old nannies at the front of the villa to drink tea and play mahjong. Only a group of young people remained by the lake. The guards were either standing or sitting in the distance, and the servant girls rarely came out to play. They chattered incessantly, reducing the peace of the lake. But without the fish eyes to disturb him, Fan Xian still felt very comfortable. He was a little further away from the crowd. He gritted his teeth and made a face to chase away the servant girl, Siki. Finally, Fan Xian was able to spend some time alone with Wan. It's so hard. Fan Xian sighed. His right hand slithered through the green grass like a snake, and like lightning he grabbed Wanner's soft little hand. His face was still calm as he looked at the lake. It's so hard to see the girl. Her hand was caught, and Wanner's face immediately turned red. She lowered her head in embarrassment, but she didn't pull her hand back. In a low voice she scolded, You're calling the girl at this time? I don't know who it is that shamelessly climbs the walls and windows every night. Chapter 117. Fan Xian chuckled and didn't argue. He just used the tip of his finger to scratch the palm of his fiancée. Although he was an old virgin who had lived 2 lives, he was still a member of the new generation who had been nurtured by Takashi Kato. How could Lin Wana resist these little tricks? The girl felt a burst of panic and couldn't sit still. Fan Xian moved closer. Why don't you lean into my arms? Big brother really has a way. Fan Xian refused to get out of the carriage. He thought there were too many mosquitoes in the grass. He looked at the couple by the lake and sighed in admiration. We've only just met our future sister-in-law and we can already sit together. If we stay a few more hours, won't we have to consummate our marriage ahead of schedule? Fan Ruoruo burst out laughing. Although she knew that her brother would occasionally visit her sister-in-law at night, she didn't know how often Fan Xian and Lin Wanner met. So when she saw this scene she was surprised and impressed. Come down and help unload the things. Ruoruo patted Fan Xian on the head and smiled. It's not good to let the guards do it. Fan Xian stared at her. What are the servants for? Fan Ruoruo smiled. They're just maids. They're not as strong as you. For some reason, seeing Fan Ruoruo's faint smile made Fan Xian, the spoiled brat, feel an inexplicable fear. He obediently climbed down from the carriage and began to help the delicate maids unload the things. It was no wonder that Fan Ruoruo wanted his help. Fan Xian had brought a lot of things with him on this trip, and it took the maids and Fan Xian half a day to unload them. Fan Xian wiped the sweat from his forehead and shouted to the lakeside, Big brother. Unload all the things. What are they? Fan Xian, who was sitting by the lake, heard the shout, and only then did he remember these things. He slapped his forehead and apologized to Wanner with some embarrassment. He stood up and brushed the grass off his bottom. He walked to the side of the carriage and began to give orders to everyone on how to arrange things. After settling down in the capital, his grandmother had sent over all the belongings he had left behind in Danzhou, so they were all put to use today. There were 3 handmade tents, an iron barbecue grill, a few pieces of iron mesh, a bag of pepper and cumin, some salt, some bamboo sticks, some eggs, a few freshwater fish, a big pile of radish and tofu, and a bag of fine charcoal. In short, it was a complete barbecue grill. A maid pointed at the pile of rags and asked curiously, "What is this?" Fan Xian kindly explained, "A tent." The servant girl was very eager to learn. "Is it used for marching and fighting?" Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "You can also watch the stars by the lake at night." Seeing the amiable smile on young Master Fan's face and the warmth in his bright eyes, the maid was no longer eager to learn. She shyly covered her face and went somewhere else. After the charcoal fire was lit, someone came over to take over. Fan Xian moved a rock and sat by the iron mesh, carefully smearing sauce and condiments on the fish. A bamboo skewer passed through the fish, and a faint aroma wafted through the fire. He sniffed and looked at Wanner, who was sitting alone by the lake in the distance. He smiled slightly and did not put too much flavor into the fish. After he finished grilling 3 skewers of fish, he gave one to each of his siblings and walked over to the lake, sitting next to Lin Wanner. "Here." Fan Xian smiled warmly. Lin Wanner looked at him suspiciously, wondering if his cooking would be good. She took it and carefully put it to her lips, then chewed it slowly. Her eyes gradually brightened and she looked at Fan Xian and giggled. She did not even have time to praise him before she began to eat. But the fish was too hot, and she could not bear to let it leave her lips. She stuck out her tongue because it was so hot, and her free hand kept fanning her mouth as she exhaled. She was cute, really cute, and could be loved. Fan Xian looked at her fleshy lips, and for some reason he thought of the chicken leg they had first met in the temple of Qin. "Chinner," he teased, "I've brought you plenty of chicken legs these days. Why are you still so greedy?" Lin Wanner puffed up her cheeks and said angrily, "If I had known your grilled food would taste so good, I wouldn't have eaten that cold chicken leg." Fan Xian laughed heartily and almost fell back. His fiancée's temperament was really interesting. Sometimes she was extremely shy, lowering her head and not daring to look at him. Sometimes she would have a little temper that added to the fun. Her sickly body liked to play the tiger cub. It was still that one word, cute 2 words, cute 3 words, kawaii. Lin Wanner turned her head and saw that the barbecue stall was much livelier than the one by the lake. Fan Xija had long since finished the fish in his hand, and was instructing a servant girl to grill some corn for him to eat. Only Ruoruo ate in a more graceful manner. As she ate, she walked through the woods. It was hard to tell whether she was enjoying the scenery or thinking about something. Her gaze fell on the pile of things that had been unloaded from the carriage, and Lin Wanner felt that her fiancé was a bit strange. She asked curiously, "In the past when we went out to play we mostly ate at the manor. I've never seen the servants so happy, and the things you brought today, no matter how you look at it, are a bit strange?" Fan Xian smiled and explained, "Although they are all servant girls, they are all serving maids who follow you around every day. They live a life of luxury. How many of them have actually cooked for themselves? Today's barbecue doesn't necessarily taste all that good, but it's better to cook for yourself. It feels different, and the reaction of the taste buds is also different." Taste buds. Lin Wanner was a bit confused. She stared at Fan Xian with wide eyes. There is a small organ on the tongue that can sense flavors. Fan Xian knew that it was difficult to explain. After all, the naked eye was not as good as a microscope, so he casually explained, "The back of the tongue tastes bitter and the front of the tongue tastes sweet. That's why." Lin Wanner chuckled. "No wonder you are Master Fei's student. You are so clear about these things." Hearing her mention Fei Jie, Fan Xian felt a belly full of anger. After all, they were master and disciple and they had a good relationship. He had been in the capital for a few months and even Qin Pingping had returned. Why did Fei Jie not want to come back? This was a bit too much. Fan Xian put these matters aside for now. Seeing Wanner's envious gaze, he set up a small stove for the 2 of them. He brought some ingredients over and the 2 of them ate as they roasted. Of course, most of the time it was Fan Xian roasting and Lin Wanner eating. Surrounded by the fragrance, the fiancé launched a gentle attack on the ingredients over the warm charcoal fire. This seasoning doesn't seem to be common. Lin Wanner stuck out the tip of her tender tongue and gently licked a sesame seed from the corner of her mouth. She sighed with satisfaction. Really smells good. You must be joking. Sesame seeds are everywhere. This bit of cumin is not easy to find. Fan Xian thought to himself. If it weren't for his good relationship with the shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall, it would have been difficult to gather all the ingredients he had brought to the summer villa. But what he said was, if you like it after we get married, I'll make it for you every day. Lin Wanner's expression changed very quickly. Of course, it wasn't the kind of change where she would turn her back on him. It was just that when she heard the word, get married, she habitually lowered her head shyly. But today's scene was not very suitable. Her lips were still greasy, and there was a smear of dust on the tip of her nose. No matter how you looked at it, she looked like a little girl who had been secretly eating in her own kitchen. Fan Xian looked at her face and chuckled. Yichen was not a particularly beautiful girl, but for some reason in his eyes, he always felt that there was nothing to nitpick about her features. There was not a sliver of her demeanor that was not cute. Seeing him laugh at her, Lin Wanner angrily prepared to pounce. Fan Xian hurriedly opened his arms, ready to sacrifice himself to feed the tiger. In any case, the lakeside was far away, and a large cluster of aquatic plants blocked the maid's view. Fan Xian thought he could openly embrace a beautiful woman for the first time. Unexpectedly, Wanner looked embarrassed, and forcibly stopped herself from rolling into Fan Xian's arms. Fan Xian shook his head helplessly. He took his handkerchief to the lakeside and wet it. Then he turned around and sat next to Lin Wanner. He stared at her face and very carefully wiped away the dust on the tip of her nose and chin. The two of them were very close. Feeling her husband's gentle and focused gaze, Lin Wanner was extremely nervous. Her hands tightly gripped the hem of her dress. Fan Xian also noticed her nervousness. For a moment he was at a loss. The hand holding the wet handkerchief paused on the side of her pink cheek. Their eyes met, and it seemed that even the sound of their breathing began to intertwine, rising and falling. They began to mix and gradually increase in frequency. Action was better than action. Without saying anything, Fan Xian lowered his head and kissed her on the forehead. Lin Wanner was startled and then embarrassed. Following that, she was faintly disappointed. However, she didn't have time to hide her disappointment. Fan Xian's lips had already blocked the mouth she was about to pretend to rebuke. It was wet, soft, fragrant, and sweet. Ouch. Fan Xian found that his lower lip had been ruthlessly bitten by the little girl. He quickly straightened up and let his lips escape the scene of the crime. Focusing his eyes, he found that Wanner's eyes were full of smiles. However, there was an additional glimmer of spring radiance in this smile. It was like the lake beside the two of them. The water rippled like a mirror, but there were still slight highs and lows and gentle currents that stirred one's soul. The cutest thing was that when the girl smiled faintly, her white front teeth, she cutely bit down on her fleshy lower lip. Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat. Summoning his remaining courage, he pulled his future wife into his arms, not letting her escape. His finger gently touched her soft cheek. In a quiet voice he said, "Little tiger, be careful that I don't eat you." Lin Wanner's body tensed and froze in his arms. Her eyes, like a spring lake, remained bewitching. She bit her lower lip and gazed at Fan Xian. "Wanner's body isn't well. Are you willing?" Chapter 118. If he was willing, how could he gain without giving up? But Fan Xian looked at this little wife who was allowing him to taste her. It was impossible for her to transform into Wuxia. His heart was already burning. If he let go now, Fan Xian would despise himself. Eating was eating, there was no need to be polite at the dining table. So the two gradually merged into one person. Although there were trees and water blocking the view, the lake and the mountains were bright and beautiful. The scene of the young couple being intimate was always faintly seen by the servant girls. The servant girls were clever and moved their gazes away. Some bent over to flip the meat, some turned their backs and pretended to check the girl's makeup box, and some didn't know what to do. They could only lower their bodies and call out softly, pretending to be a poor girl with a sprained ankle. Fan Xianzhe was chewing and didn't notice the demons quarreling by the lake. Ruoruo was walking by the forest to digest her food and didn't seem to see this side. And the reason why the servant girls didn't cough dozens of times to prevent such an immoral thing from happening was because of Fan Xian's spoon-feeding policy these days. If one wanted to plot for state affairs, one had to bribe the head of the eunuchs. If one wanted to plot for family affairs, one had to bribe the personal servant girls. Fan Xian understood this deeply, so these days he rewarded them every once in a while. Relying on his position as an assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue and the fact that Dombo bookstore was constantly raking in money, he was very generous. The servant girls were very happy, and they had long tilted the scales in favor of their future son-in-law. After an indeterminate amount of time, the two people by the lake finally separated with difficulty breathing. They were panting and their hair was slightly disheveled. They looked somewhat disheveled. It didn't look like they were intimate, but more like they had fought. Lin Wanner stretched out her hand and ran her hand through her hair. Out of the corner of her eye, she glanced at the distant servant girls. She guessed that no one had seen them, but she was still angry and embarrassed. She glared fiercely at Fan Xian, thinking that this was too absurd in broad daylight. But there seemed to be a lingering sweet scent on her lips, and it made the little girl's heart flutter with sweetness. "What are you afraid of? I've never seen you so uncomfortable at night." Fan Xian quietly laughed in her ear. His finger used a little trick to gently flick her white and smooth earlobe. Wanner let out another soft cry. She couldn't hold it in anymore. She clenched her small fist and punched him in the chest. She murdered her husband. In his previous life, Fan Xian and his companions had long since grown tired of this joke. But saying it to his real fiancée by the lake gave him a different feeling. Wanner snapped at him and Fan Xian felt a sharp pain in his wrist. He forced himself not to cry out. He smiled bitterly and said, "It's not a fight between fairies. Why are you so fierce?" The story of the fairies fighting came from the 73rd chapter of The Dream of the Red Chamber. The silly big sister picked up a sachet from the Grand View Garden. On the sachet was an embroidered image of a naked man and woman hugging and sitting cross-legged. The silly big sister did not know that it was an erotic painting and thought that the fairies were fighting. Later, she casually handed it over to Madame Xing, which led to the scene of the Grand View Garden being raided. Originally, no one in the kingdom of Qing should have known this story. But a few days ago, Lin Wanner had heard that her Langjun had opened a bookstore that claimed to have the entire story of the stone, so she had forced Fan Xian to copy the last 10 chapters. Hearing these words today, she immediately blushed. "What kind of person do you think I am?" she asked, a little sulkily. Fan Xian laughed and said, "Of course I am a good person. Someone in the past has said that when fairies fight, they fight with the utmost kindness and beauty. Besides, we were just fairies quarreling." "Bah. I don't know where you got this crooked theory from, but you still have to borrow the name of someone in the past." Lin Wanner giggled. "Besides, what's the difference between fairies fighting and quarreling? In a fight, the hands dance and the feet dance. Every part of the body that can be used has to be used. When it comes to quarreling, of course, only the mouth is used." Die. Fan Xian's heart was filled with pride. "Then I'll die on top of you." During the summer retreat from the summer heat, a man and a woman in love were in the midst of a beautiful lake and green mountains. It was the easiest time to pass. In the blink of an eye, it was already noon. The old nannies, who had been left behind by Fan Ruoruo to play Ma Diao in the front of the manor, finally remembered what they were here to do. They eagerly rushed over and smiled at Fan Xian. It seemed that they had gained a lot from the Fan family during the mahjong game. But Fan Xian still didn't like them. With the arrival of these old nannies, no matter what, he would not be able to get close to them. He had to sit and be polite, and he was far away from Wanner. At noon, Fan Xian could not let Fan Xian fool around with roasted fish. The group of people returned to the manor in a grandiose manner. They chose an elegant courtyard, and servants went to prepare food. As they drank tea and chatted, they heard the sound of carriages coming from afar. Fan Xian and Lin Wanner stood up at the same time with a smile. It seemed that they both knew who was coming, but they found that the other had also stood up. They couldn't help but look at each other in surprise. They were guests and they were all guests. But Fan Xian and Lin Wanner had invited them separately. At first, they didn't know each other, so when they saw the people in the carriages disembark, Fan Xian and Wanner were both surprised. Wanner was surprised, but she was also nervous and sad. Fan Xian was surprised, but he was also nervous, and had a headache. Lin Wanner had invited Yi Linger. She knew of the fight between the two of them outside the royal courtyard, so she had purposely taken this opportunity to have Yi Linger and Fan Xian interact more and eliminate the animosity between them. She also wanted to be the mediator between the two of them. Fan Xian naturally understood Wanner's intentions. He smiled and went forward, cupping his hands in salute. "Greetings, Miss Yi." After what had happened that day, Yi Linger's nose was still sore, but she showed no signs of bashfulness. Instead, she cupped her hands in a chivalrous gesture. "Greetings, Master Fan. Master Fan is skilled and I am impressed." Fan Xian chuckled, but he had a strange feeling in his heart. Were they going to shoot a historical film in ancient times? Fan Xizha watched Yi Linger disembark from the carriage and greet his brother. He lowered his voice and said to Roro, "Sister, I understand. My future sister-in-law wants to be a mediator." Fan Roro made a sound of agreement. She smiled and prepared to go forward to greet her brother. Unexpectedly, she heard what Fan Xizha said next and stopped in her tracks. She heard Fan Xizha say lewdly, "I'm afraid that when your sister-in-law opens the door to welcome guests, she wants to welcome a younger sister." Fan Roro spat and knocked Fan Xizha on the forehead. She scolded him in a low voice. "Let's not talk about my brother's intentions. Even if he wanted to marry with Miss Ye's status, would she be a concubine?" In her heart, it didn't matter who her brother married as long as he liked her. In this regard, it was similar to Fan Xian's expectations of her. A fat man disembarked from the other carriage. With the help of a maidservant, he looked around in a panic. Fan Xian gave Roro a look, indicating for her to take Yi Linger to rest. With one hand he gently tugged on Wanner's sleeve. Lin Wanner looked at the fat man and couldn't help but cover her mouth with her hand, but she still let out a soft cry. When she turned her head to look at Fan Xian, her eyes were full of gratitude. "Go." Fan Xian encouraged her with a gentle smile, and the two of them walked over to the carriage. When the fat man saw Fan Xian, his originally frightened expression immediately turned into a wide smile. The already wide space between his brows immediately became even longer. He moved forward a few steps and pulled Fan Xian's hand. "Little Xian, so it's you. Debao, didn't we agree not to call me that?" Fan Xian said with a pained expression. Lin Wanna was a little sad. She thought that her silly brother, whom she had only seen a few times, seemed to have forgotten her. But hearing Debao call Fan Xian, she couldn't help but laugh. "Little Xian?" Fan Xian nodded helplessly. "Thank you." Lin Wanner looked at Fan Xian, moved. "You know it's not convenient for me to see him." "I know." Fan Xian smiled. He turned and patted Debao on the shoulder. "Debao, there's no polo today, but there's something else to play with." The courtyard was at the bottom of the hill. It was wide open and they could see the blue lake in the distance. Debao sniffled and shook his head. "Little Xian, the water is green, not blue." Fan Xian sighed. "Because the water isn't deep enough." "Then let's go see how deep it is." Fan Xian's wishful thinking was to bring Debao over today. 1. It would prevent his brother-in-law from being bored at home all day, and 2. It would give him to Fan Xizha to play with. In any case, they were just two children. How could he know that Fan Xizha had an innate sensitivity to things like being taken advantage of? As soon as he saw a big idiot, he hid far away. Fan Xian could only helplessly walk down the hill with Debao by the hand. He thought to himself that lunch was probably over. Just as the silly son-in-law and uncle were about to walk out the door, Debao suddenly turned his head and looked at Lin Wanner seriously. "Sister, why didn't you come?" Lin Wanner was startled at first and then her heart ached. It turned out that her silly brother, whom she had only seen a few times, still remembered that he had a sister like her. She hurriedly responded and stepped forward to hold Debao's other hand. Night fell. The faint sound of mahjong tiles falling to the ground could be heard in the distant attic. The guards gathered in one place to drink. The world was peaceful and they all let down their guard. The servant girls were tired from playing during the day. After drinking a few cups of yellow wine, they went to sleep. As for the masters they served, they had long since withdrawn their curtains to rest. Occasionally, frogs croaked from the pond by the forest, and the occasional sound of fish breaking through the water could be heard in the lake. It made the imperial summer villa even more peaceful. In a remote place near the lake, there was a tent hiding from the moonlight. It was quietly hidden in the forest, receiving the night breeze from the lake. It was the middle of the night when no one was whispering. In the tent, a young couple were whispering to each other. Chapter 119. Aren't you afraid of Si Chi finding out that you carried me out like this? She sleeps so deeply every day. I don't even need to use the sleeping incense. I don't think she'll wake up. But, it's a bit embarrassing. Just to look at the stars. Can you believe what you say? Then what are you going to do, Wanner? Fan Xian looked at her face with an evil smile. The moonlight outside the tent was not bright, so Lin Wanner's face was particularly hazy and beautiful. Lin Wanner wrinkled her pretty nose and faked a sigh. What can I do if I let a big pervert like you steal people in the middle of the night? Fan Xian also sighed. I'm also worried that if we keep sneaking around like this after we get married, What if we go back to our bedroom and I don't know how to use the door? What should I do then? Lin Wan-er spat at him. She was afraid that his thoughts would really turn to evil. After all, it was the dead of night and the two of them were alone. If he really wanted to do something, she would be powerless to stop him. Fan Xian didn't know the girl's thoughts. If he knew that Lin Wan-er was already thinking that she was powerless to stop him, he would probably have leapt forward a long time ago. As the saying goes, it's not that it's impossible, but it's that it's not that it's impossible. In Fan Xian's mind, once a girl thought that she was powerless to stop him, then she was already prepared not to stop him. The two of them lay on the soft mattress. The mosquito net was pulled open a crack. Looking out, they could see the starry sky. The moon was dim, so the stars were particularly bright. In the dark night with a hint of blue, they gently watched all the couples on the ground. Lin Wan-er reclined in Fan Xian's arms. Fan Xian only smelled a light fragrance. His chest and abdomen were the girl's soft and bouncy back. The summer youth's green robe was thin, as if there was no fabric between the two of them. Without a doubt, any man who had yet to respond, regardless of whether he was 16 or 60, had already fallen to the stage of being worse than a beast. So Fan Xian nervously tightened his arms, bringing the two of them closer to each other, not leaving any distance between them. Confused or blissful, he felt every bit of touch and elasticity in his arms. Fan Xian began to perform magic. His right hand had been holding Wanner's hand, but in the next moment, it had somehow run to the girl's thin clothes. The tent was incomparably quiet, and even the slight sound of the waves on the lake seemed extremely bashful. After a long time, a few shameful voices came from the tent, along with the intoxicated voice of the young man. There are always some things in the world that cannot be seen with one's eyes. It is really difficult to grasp, very difficult to grasp. Lin Wanner's ears were red, and she made a sound of agreement. She twisted her body to free herself from Fan Xian's demonic grasp, but she was no match for the explosive power of a virgin. Her body was teased until it became more and more limp. In her desperation, she coughed and forced herself to look weak. As expected, Fan Xian was startled, thinking that she had caught a cold. He hurriedly recited the heart-cleansing kindness mantra a few times to suppress his desires. He straightened her clothes and pulled the blanket over her. Lin Wanner's embarrassment had not yet faded, but she felt a little amused and touched. Afraid that he would change again, she rolled her eyes and changed the topic. Today, Bai Jian, I saw that you made some fresh things. If I were to sell them, I'm afraid they would sell for a lot, right? She was talking about the barbecue condiments and the tent they were currently living in. Fan Xian was now a little dissatisfied. He said in a hoarse voice, "You are a princess. Why are you worrying about such a small amount of money? Come, let's kiss again." Lin Wanner was both embarrassed and anxious. You open a bookstore and you make tofu. People think you like to do business. Fan Xian thought that making tofu was one thing but eating tofu was another. He replied with a pained expression, "I have to prove that I can make money. Only then will our uncle, the emperor, be at ease when he leaves the palace treasury to us to manage." After he entered the capital, he had focused on doing business and befriended Qingyu Hall for this matter. The two of them had finally calmed down. They hugged each other, gazed at the stars and chatted idly. Somehow, they began to talk about Fan Xian's visit to the Prime Minister's manor a few days ago. "Father, is he well?" Lin Wanner asked with concern. She rarely saw her father, but she still missed him. Today she had seen her foolish brother and thought of how her second brother, Lin Gong, had died young. Her father was alone and he must have been very sad. As his son, she was unable to serve him. Fan Xian knew what she was thinking. He comforted her. "He's fine. After we get married we can be filial together. It's better than now. All right. The Prime Minister has really agreed to our marriage." Their voices grew lower and lower until they could not be heard. They disappeared into the quiet night by the lake. As for what else happened that night, they would have to think about it later. The next day the sky was bright. It was impossible for the two of them to still be in their tents. Otherwise, if the guards and maids found out that their mistress and future master had been affectionate outside all night, it would certainly become the most sensational gossip in the capital. Fan Xian and Lin Wanner opened their eyes on their respective beds. They rubbed their eyes, turned over, smiled, reminisced, and foolishly stretched their bodies. After everyone got up, they began to eat at separate tables. The maids and servants busied themselves. Lin Wanner sat at the round table, gently putting shredded pickled vegetables into De Bao's bowl of porridge. She did not even glance at Fan Xian. On the other side, Fan Xian smiled foolishly and blew at his sister's bowl to cool it down. It seemed like a special brother-sister bond. Fan Xian and Lin Wanner did not look at each other, but there was some kind of emotion between their brows. The whole hall began to emit the smell of happiness. The sensitive Yi Linger and the intelligent Fan Ruoruo looked at each other suspiciously, and then tacitly averted their gazes. It was still early. After eating, Fan Xian was about to find a secluded place in the woods to exercise and maintain his daily practice. To his surprise, Yi Linger walked up to him, cupped her fists and asked for his guidance. After Yi Linger returned to the manor, she told her father about the contest outside the royal courtyard. Yi Zhong asked about it in detail and praised Fan Xian's response. He said that Master Fan had been able to evade the assassination attempt and cut open Qing Jushu. He was indeed extraordinary. Hearing her father's words, Yi Linger was finally convinced of Fan Xian's abilities. But she adhered to the ideals of the Yi family, and whenever she found an opportunity she would sincerely ask Fan Xian for guidance. Asking for guidance only proved that Yi Linger was not convinced to the bone. Fan Xian rarely trained with others. Back in Danzhou he was a pitiful character who was beaten by Uncle Wuzhu. So today he had the right to give advice to Yi Linger, a 7th-level master. He could not help but feel a little happy. His words of advice were sincere, but Wuzhu was not a good teacher and neither was Fan Xian. He could only tell her how to punch straight and how to save energy. He could only start from the surface and could not sum up a complete theory. The so-called little tricks were Fan Xian's current set of killing techniques. But it was not convenient to teach them to others, especially to a beautiful girl with eyes as clear as jade. Besides, Fan Xian was not an honest person who would dig out the heart of anyone he met, so it was impossible for Yi Linger to learn the essence of Wu Zhu's killing techniques. But in the end she had made some progress. Fan Xian smiled. Today he had finally seen the Yi family's Luoyuan Sanzhou clearly. It turned out that a simple pair of hands could evolve into so many attacking methods. Even Yi Linger had the power to break through the wind and kill gods. If it had been Yi Zhong or Yi Luoyuan himself, perhaps the coffin breaker would have been enough to break the stone tomb, and the Sanzhou would have been like a withered twig, making it impossible for the opponent to dodge. After a series of punches and palms, Fan Xian was very satisfied with the degree of flexibility of Yi Linger's body. But the way he looked at her slender waist with a smile was a little strange. Yi Linger did not notice his gaze, or she would have been furious. She was still immersed in the perfect coordination of Fan Xian's attacks, the angle of his attacks, and the feeling of their perfect coordination. She was deeply shocked. In short, this was not a bad deal. After a long time, a cry of pain came from the forest. Fan Xian walked out, rubbing his wrist. Behind him Yi Linger also walked out, holding her nose. She had finally become completely obedient. In truth, for everyone in this world, life was like a running account. It was just one step after another, repeating itself day after day. It was inevitable that it would be a little boring. But these two things, power and wealth, seemed to guarantee that a running account would occasionally have some new numbers appear. Fan Xian had kicked a Bao and Fan Xizha to the back of the mountain to ride horses and shoot arrows. There were guards to protect them and maids to take care of them, so there was no need to worry too much. Now in the summer resort there was only him and the 3 girls, Wanner, his sister, and Yi Linger. Sitting in the courtyard, sipping tea and listening to music, Fan Xian smiled as he watched a beautiful girl sing in a low voice. Power was a good thing, he thought. If a princess wanted to hear a song, she could immediately call someone from the capital to sing for her. This girl was a true singer, and with her beautiful voice she could roam the courtyards of the nobility in the capital. She was also someone who was virtuous. It was only at this moment that Fan Xian realized what it meant to be a man of the kingdom of Qing. He had to fight for power and wealth for the people around him. If he wanted to maintain a seemingly happy and peaceful life, and not become a bandit on the border or a hard laborer in a brick kiln, perhaps there were some things that were worth giving up. He was a selfish man, he often reminded himself of this. In front of the mountain hall, the girl called Sangwen had a clear and crisp voice. It mixed with the cool breeze, passing through the hall and lingering on the beams. Before and after winter there were several villages. North of the stream, south of the stream, on the lonely mountain at the top and bottom of the tree. Where does fragrance come from in the cold wind? Suddenly we meet in silk garments. When one wakes up from a drunken stupor, the mournful sound of the flute breaks one's heart, and the faint yellow moon. Chapter 120. Good song, good words. Fan Ruoruo smiled and sighed. Miss Sang's singing skills are indeed extraordinary. Sangwon was pleased to receive praise from the famous young lady of the Fan family. She blushed slightly as she bowed. The scenery of winter and the coldness of spring make this scorching summer a bit more refreshing. Lin Wan-er nodded in agreement. Fan Xian had been reborn in the kingdom of Qing for 16 years, but he still didn't like to listen to songs. He often missed Yang Zhongwei's singing from his previous life. Thinking of Yang Zhongwei, he thought of He Zhongwei, who had often come to Fan Manor to pay his respects. He frowned, and for some reason he loathed that gifted scholar. But the line in Sangwen's song, "Suddenly meeting in a white silk robe," had stirred up something in him. The white silk robe consisted of white silk sleeves and a thin silk undergarment, as plain as a white plum blossom. And when he had first met Wan-er in front of the incense burner table in the temple of Qin, hadn't she been wearing a white robe, like a plain plum blossom? But that winter plum blossom had the smell of a chicken leg. Fan Xian unconsciously looked at Lin Wan-er, and found that she was also looking at him. When their eyes met, Fan Xian smiled and Lin Wan-er blushed slightly. Although Yi Ling-er had long since acknowledged Fan Xian's abilities, seeing the dark ripples in front of her still made her feel uncomfortable. She coughed. "I don't really like listening to songs." Fan Xian laughed. "It seems that Miss Yi and I are both coarse people." Calling himself a coarse person was one thing, but his words dragged Yi Ling-er in as well. The other two girls couldn't help but laugh. Even Sangwen, who had been in a daze, couldn't help but cover her mouth. Fan Xian was the only man in the mountain hall. Beside him sat his sister and Wan. Yi Ling-er sat next to Wan-er, and the atmosphere was filled with the faint scent of a young girl. It made Fan Xian feel very good, and he sighed that his life had not been in vain. As long as Princess Rojia wasn't by his side, Fan Xian thought with some fear. Young girls were the most beautiful things in the world, but if they always looked at you as if you were a husband in 10 years, then that wasn't good. At that moment, Sangwen suddenly gathered her courage and curtsied. "I would like to ask Master Fan to say a few words." In the capital, artists competed with their extravagance and the level of their fans. It depended on whether the people who listened to their songs were princes or dukes. But in the end it was still a competition of ability, which was their ability to sing and write songs. Miss Sang had caught the eye of both the princess and the young lady of the Fan family. Naturally, she was an important person, and she thought about her songs and poems day and night. Today by chance she had met Master Fan, who was famous in poetry in the capital. She could no longer be reserved, and regardless of the difference in status, she bravely made this somewhat presumptuous request. Fan Xian was startled, but Lin Wan-er and his sister were already giggling as they allowed him to write. Even Yi Ling-er opened her eyes wide in curiosity, wanting to see what kind of sentence he would come up with. Fan Xian was annoyed to the point that he had no choice but to go into the inner room and lay out some paper and ink. Ruoro had long since sat down in front of the desk, brush in hand, and waited. It turned out that Fan Xian was just a page boy. The three girls who followed him into the room couldn't help but laugh when they saw this. "My sister's handwriting is better," Fan Xian explained a little awkwardly. Although he had practiced calligraphy diligently in Danzhou, it was still not as beautiful as his sister's, so he simply let her do it. Not long after, Ruoro had written down a few lines that Fan Xian had recited in small delicate script. When Sangwen first heard it, her eyes brightened. She nervously took the piece of paper and read it carefully. She was overjoyed and bowed to Fan Xian. "Sangwen thanks Master Fan for the poem. Words cannot express my gratitude." Lin Wan-er and Ruoro also nodded repeatedly, believing that Fan Xian's poem was worthy of the word gratitude. If Sangwen composed a good song and sang it all over the capital, she would probably have a few more good years ahead of her. Fan Xian was copying Tang Xinzu's clever line today, "So the beautiful flowers and purples bloom everywhere, but like this they all give way to broken wells and decadent walls. A beautiful scene on a fine day, but heaven forbid it. Whose courtyard is it to delight the heart and delight the heart? Flying in the morning and rolling in the evening, the rosy clouds and green pavilions, the rain and wind, the smoke and waves of the painted boat, the beautiful screen makes people look at this cheap beauty." Looking at the intoxicated expressions on the faces of the women, he sighed and shook his head. He thought that the whole story of the Peony Pavilion was a wonderful piece of writing. Although it was beautiful, it lacked the spirit of the story. However, he was busy with dating, business, and dating. Even the outing had to last for 2 days. How could he have the time to think about it? It seemed that the work of spreading advanced culture was indeed very difficult. It's a little too tragic. Yi Ling-er, who had been silent all this time, was a little slow to react. She only now realized the true meaning of the line and spoke sadly. Suddenly Ruoro's expression changed. She thought of the line, "A beautiful scene on a fine day but heaven forbid it." It had already appeared in Story of the Stone, where Lin Dayu played the drinking game. If Sangwon sang this line all over the capital, wouldn't people immediately know that Story of the Stone had been written by her brother? But seeing that Fan Xian seemed to have forgotten about it, and that deep in her heart she also wanted her brother to make a name for himself, she couldn't help but smile, and she didn't mention it again. The outing ended satisfactorily. Everyone got what they wanted before they came. Yi Linger got some tricks, Sangwon got Fan Xian's poem, Fan Xizha got a belly full of roasted fish and meat, and De Bao got a horse back to the Prime Minister's manor. Fan Ruoro got 2 days of elegant scenery to clear her mind, and Lin Wanner got the chance to get close to her brother. Fan Xian got the most, but he couldn't say it. If it ended like this, everyone would be happy. But when Fan Xian heard Wang Qinyan's report, he frowned. He really hadn't expected things to be so coincidental. The Crown Prince was coming. Retreat. Hearing that the Crown Prince was coming to the summer residence that day, Fan Xian didn't say anything else. He ordered Wang Qinyan to arrange for his group to retreat back to the capital. What a joke. If the Crown Prince was coming to spend the summer, would he dare fight for territory with him? Furthermore, the Fan family had always been considered part of the Second Prince's faction. The Prime Minister had broken off relations with the Eastern Palace, and the Overwatch Council was clinging to the Emperor. Although the power behind Fan Xian was great, they were all the Crown Prince's most hated targets. If the two sides really did meet, even if Fan Xian had a fake princess at his side and the young ladies of the Yi and Fan families, if the Crown Prince really wanted to humiliate him, Fan Xian would have no one to go to. The Emperor had said at the Green Bamboo Tea House by the Lujing River that Fan Xian should be able to live comfortably in the capital. But the Crown Prince probably didn't like Fan Xian being comfortable. If there was a difference of opinion between father and son, Fan Xian didn't have the arrogance to think that the Emperor would deal with his own son for the sake of a mere official son. So he had to retreat cleanly and efficiently. He didn't want to give the Crown Prince a chance to see him or humiliate him. At the same time, he didn't want to give himself a chance to be humiliated and beat the Crown Prince after he was humiliated, committing a heaven-defying crime. He had come confidently, but now he had to retreat in fear. Fan Xian didn't feel good about it. Lin Wanner frowned unhappily. Brother Qingqian wasn't a tiger, so why was her husband so afraid? Yi Linger also looked down on Fan Xian, who was afraid of the nobility. So what if he was the Crown Prince? When he was young, the Emperor had sent him to the Yi family to learn martial arts. She had beaten him up too. After all, Fan Xian was only an 8th-level functionary, a mere illegitimate son of Count Sinan. He wasn't like these two girls who had been in and out of the palace since they were young, and were used to seeing the world's top figures. Furthermore, his thoughts were much more mature than these girls, and he knew that this matter was a bit sensitive. Because he had arranged things quickly, by the time the Crown Prince's entourage was about to arrive at the summer estate, Fan Xian's entourage was already on the official road. The two sides brushed past each other. At that moment, a gong rang out as if a performance was about to begin. The Crown Prince's entourage stopped, and a palace guard called for Fan Xian's entourage to stop as well. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the carriage and looked out expressionlessly. In the bright yellow carriage, the Crown Prince's entourage, the future most powerful man in the world, was weakly talking to the carriage behind him. The Crown Prince, Li Qingqian, had handsome features, but he didn't look well. His face was a bit pale and the corners of his lips were a bit black. He had come to the mountain resort to spend the summer. He hadn't expected to see Wanner and the girl from the Yi family on the road. They had grown up together, so he had stopped to chat. Knowing that Wanner had spent the night at the summer estate, Li Qingqian's heart ached. "Why don't you take care of your body?" he said. "The imperial doctor said that you are most afraid of cold." Yi Linger laughed and interjected. "Sister Lin, you don't have to worry about that. You have a famous doctor by your side." Lin Wanner frowned and looked at Yi Linger. "It's already summer," she explained with a smile. "How could I catch a cold?" But he didn't change the subject. The Crown Prince was very curious about what Yi Linger was talking about, and asked for more details. Only then did he learn that the person in the carriage in front of them was Wanner's future husband. He was very surprised. The Fan family's underground fighter? He has become famous recently. Quickly have him come and let me take a look. "Forget it, Your Highness. Don't scare him," said Lin Wanner awkwardly. The Crown Prince frowned. "The Emperor's family has a few poor relatives. In the future when you are married he will be my brother-in-law. What is there to be afraid of? Besides, in a few days, father will summon him to the palace to pay his respects to the concubines. He paused for a moment, then continued, moreover, the imperial court is about to give him a position. Could it be that he still wants to hide? These words were extremely heavy, and the two carriages immediately quietened down. Greetings, Your Highness. A voice broke the silence. At some point, Fan Xian had arrived in front of the Crown Prince's carriage. He smiled and bowed. Chapter 121. The Crown Prince, Li Qingqian, had a weak temperament and a weak body. This was what Fan Xian knew of the Crown Prince. After bowing, he raised his head somewhat rudely and looked at the Crown Prince with a slight smile. Although the Crown Prince's identity was noble, Fan Xian felt that he and the Emperor had both drunk tea and chatted. Facing his son, he would not be too nervous. He had not wanted to come out and meet the Crown Prince, but the talkative Yi Linger had shattered his fantasy. When Fan Xian looked at the Crown Prince looked back at him with interest. For the Crown Prince, the fact that Fan Xian's name had shaken the capital in just a few short months was already an anomaly. Furthermore, his father had appointed him to marry one. As the master of the Eastern Palace, the Crown Prince was well aware of the meaning behind it. If the eldest princess lost the right to manage the palace treasury, and the person who took over was an enemy, the messy debts of the past would come to light. This was what the Crown Prince was most worried about. Fortunately, it would take another 2 years for the palace treasury to change hands, so it was not an urgent matter. But the Fan family was on good terms with King Jing, and Crown Prince Jing's son Li Hongqing was on good terms with his second brother. The Crown Prince frowned slightly. Looking at the beautiful young man below the carriage, he momentarily forgot to speak. The advisors in the Eastern Palace were now divided into two factions. Whether to attack or pull the Fan family was still being considered. If it was a normal manner, the Crown Prince would not care too much. But the Fan family was different. The grandmother of the young man before him was his father's wet nurse. With this layer of relationship, the Crown Prince could not do anything to the Fan family. You are Fan Xian? The Crown Prince finally realized that he was a little absent-minded. After a slight pause, he asked with a smile. Your subject Fan Xian greets the Crown Prince. Fan Xian bowed again with great respect. I did not know the Crown Prince's carriage was here, so I did not get out. Please forgive me, Your Highness. Looking at Fan Xian's elegant face, for some reason, the Crown Prince's original dislike for him lessened. In that instant he decided to temporarily wait and see. He quietly said, those who do not know are not guilty. But my sister Wanner is weak and sickly. You must pay more attention to her. Do not be like those youths in the capital who only seek temporary pleasure. I'm afraid. Fan Xian could tell that the Crown Prince was not planning to deal with him today. He felt slightly at ease and replied gently. Don't be too cautious. After the wedding in October, you'll be considered a relative of the country. You'll have to visit the palace often, so you should be more relaxed, the Crown Prince lectured. Fan Xian smiled slightly and replied yes. Unexpectedly, the Crown Prince's next words surprised him. Envoys from Dongyi and Northern Qi will soon enter the capital. Because the incident at Nyolan Street is related to you, the court has decided to make you a deputy and temporarily raise your rank. I am informing you ahead of time so that you can make some preparations and not panic. The Crown Prince spoke lightly, thinking that he had unknowingly done Fan Xian a favor. Fan Xian paused for a moment, then said, I am the functionary of Taichang Temple. I am afraid it would be inappropriate for me to participate in national negotiations. The Crown Prince snorted coldly and said, if you don't have any achievements, how are you going to face yourself in court in the future? Fan Xian could tell that the Crown Prince was a little angry. He quickly agreed and thanked the Crown Prince, then moved aside to make way. The Crown Prince waved the black horsewhip in his hand with golden threads and nodded his head in satisfaction. He then turned to Lin Wanner and warmly said, you should go to the palace more often. I miss you very much. He paused and then said, recently I often have a headache. There was nothing strange in the Crown Prince's voice, and his expression was as gentle as ever. But Fan Xian could see a trace of unease in the Crown Prince's cowardly eyes. Lin Wanner smiled and said nothing. Crown Prince, let's go. The Crown Prince's carriages began to move, moving slowly in the direction of the mountain resort. Fan Xian didn't dare move until the carriages had disappeared at the end of the road. Only then did he let out a sigh and stretch his stiff waist. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. Being an official is a tough life. Don't tell me you dare have thoughts of disloyalty? Yi Ling mocked him. Ling don't talk nonsense. Xizha was afraid of Ruoruo, and Yi Ling was afraid of the little tiger. Lin Wanner was angry and Yi Ling immediately jumped back into the carriage. Lin Wanner walked to Fan Xian's side and saw that he was still looking in the direction the carriage had disappeared in. She couldn't help but sigh. I know what you're worried about. But none of my 3 brothers are easy to get along with. I think it's best if you don't side with any of them. Fan Xian had always acknowledged Lin Wanner's political wisdom, which she had cultivated deep in the palace. He nodded solemnly, then suddenly thought of something. What about the youngest prince? Is he also a difficult person to deal with? Wen Yun is only 8 years old. He doesn't understand these things. Lin Wanner continued to comfort him. The nominal position of Taichang Temple's son-in-law, joining in on the ceremonial negotiations, has been done before. It's not as if the Eastern Palace really wants to recruit you. Don't worry. Fan Xian smiled, thinking that he was already quite relaxed, but he still faked a sigh. It's just that when I see the Crown Prince of the Eastern Palace, the future ruler of the Kingdom of Qing, I can't help but feel nervous. Was strange. Although in his previous life, the highest official Fan Xian had seen before his illness had only been the headmaster of a school, after his rebirth, perhaps because he had been born into a family of officials, he didn't feel nervous when he saw important people. Even when he saw the emperor a few days ago, he was able to hide it well. Lin Wanner couldn't help but laugh. She pulled on his sleeve. Didn't you hear what the crown prince said? Before the wedding, you have to go to the palace to pay your respects to the various concubines. If that ancestor is happy, it's not impossible for him to see you. After walking through a dozen palaces, even if you're nervous, you'll become numb. Ancestor? Fan Xian knew that Lin Wanner was talking about the Empress Dowager, who lived deep in the palace. For some reason he shivered. Let's go. Your Highness has already gone so far. Why are you still standing there looking at the horses? But Fan Xizha, who had been silent for a long time, finally couldn't help but yell from the carriage in front. De Bao, who was in the carriage in the middle, heard someone yelling and also yelled happily. Fan Xian laughed. With a wave of his sleeve, he threw all these thoughts to the back of his mind. In Fan Xian's mind, since he was lucky enough to live again, he had to live it to the fullest. Women, money, power, he couldn't complain that it was too little. But after entering the capital, he saw the murky waters and couldn't tell how deep they were. He couldn't help but feel annoyed. Dombo Bookstore's business was good. The last few chapters of Story of the Stone were about to be printed, and money was coming in. In the future, even if he took over the palace treasury, he would find a way to leave it to Qingyu Hall and Fan Xizha. As for the matters of the court, his father, Qin Pingping, and his mother's former comrades would stand in front of him. As for the dangers lurking in the dark, he had Uncle Wu Zhu as his bodyguard. Even if Uncle Wu Zhu didn't want to see the sun like that time on Yolan Street, Fan Xian felt that he had the ability to protect himself. So all of a sudden, he felt that he had the potential to become a free and unfettered rich man. This was still just a fantasy. He and the people around him all knew this. Snapping his fingers, Fan Xian looked calmly at the dirt road outside the carriage window. What a coincidence, he said. North, south, east, west and west of the capital, there are 13 royal residences, 2 temporary imperial residences and 1 hunting ground. Given the crown prince's status, he could use any of them. Why did he come to the summer estate today? The summer resort is far from the capital and it's quiet. That's why we chose this place first. After setting off again, he and Wang Qinian were alone in the carriage, so they spoke very directly. Wang Qinian also frowned. If someone deliberately let the crown prince come to the summer resort so that we could have a conflict with the crown prince, this kind of arrangement is too complicated, and it won't necessarily be effective. Fan Xian shook his head, a slight chill in his eyes. As long as there are people by the crown prince's side, it wouldn't be difficult to slightly influence the crown prince's destination. And my reputation in the capital has always been based on the word arrogant. I reckon that whoever arranged for us to meet the crown prince by chance wouldn't have thought that the crown prince wouldn't be angry at me for stealing his silver, and that I would behave myself. It's just that I don't know the rules of the palace. For example, how long does it usually take for the crown prince to travel out of the capital? We arrived at the summer resort yesterday. If the crown prince decided to come here a few days ago, then we can be sure that this was a coincidence, and not an arrangement by someone with ulterior motives. Wang Qinian analyzed. Fan Xian shook his head again. I already asked the princess when I was in the carriage. When the crown prince travels, as long as he doesn't stray more than 28 miles from the capital, then he only needs to report to the palace. All the preparations will take about a day. Looking at the time we met, the crown prince will probably leave the palace this morning. Wang Qinian looked at Fan Xian worriedly and said in a low voice, "What benefit could the person who arranged this matter have?" Fan Xian laughed. "There are many benefits. If the crown prince really humiliates me, I reckon that the Fan family will have no choice but to carry the flag and show our allegiance." "Is it the second prince?" Wang Qinian probed. Fan Xian thought that during this period of time after entering the capital, the second prince had repeatedly summoned him, but he had never met him. He really didn't know what kind of character this man who was unwilling to be a peaceful prince was. However, he would not judge everything arbitrarily. In a quiet voice he said, "Who knows? Everyone in the palace is like a demon. I don't care." It would be a lie to say that he didn't care. He still arranged for Wang Qinian to get out of the carriage to see if anyone was following them. He believed that with Wang Qinian's ability, if someone was secretly watching him on the official road, then he would certainly be able to catch them. If there was no one watching over his caravan to facilitate that chance encounter on the official road, then it could only mean that he was overly sensitive and paranoid. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and leaned against the soft cushions of the carriage, hoping that he really was being overly sensitive. Chapter 122. There was a house on the side of Xinjing Road in the capital. Wang Qinian had spent 120 taels of silver to buy it. There had been a number of procedures, and he believed that no one would be able to find out who the real owner was. Fan Xian frowned as he looked at the two men tied up tightly in the corner. Their mouths were stuffed full of smelly rags and their faces were red. Tears were streaming from the corners of their eyes. They couldn't speak and they couldn't kill themselves by biting their tongues. Where were they caught? Fan Xian asked quietly. The 4th Bureau personnel behind Wang Qinian bowed and replied, 7 miles outside the city, Sir Wang found traces of the other party. After they were stopped by us, they tried to quibble, but they couldn't withstand our investigation, so they admitted to it. After you left the capital yesterday, these 2 people have been following you. I don't know what method they used to inform their people, but I don't know what relationship they have with the Eastern Palace to arrange this coincidental meeting. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He had not thought that his random guess would actually reveal a clue to a conspiracy. It looked like it was not that he was too wise, but that his enemies were too stupid. Jingdo was too dark and everyone had a forked black tail behind them. He also understood that the investigation his subordinate spoke of must have involved torture. But since they had admitted to it, no one cared what methods they used. Did you find out who they were? Fan Xian asked Wang Qinian in a low voice. Wang Qinian shook his head. The less I know, the better. So I waited for you to interrogate them personally. Fan Xian nodded. He was happy with his cautiousness, but then he fell into deep thought. He looked at the 2 men in the corner and could easily see something else in their eyes. They had such a determined expression, but had not been trained in torture. Firstly, they couldn't be from the Overwatch Council, and secondly, they couldn't be from the palace. They had already been examined and found not to be eunuchs. So the most likely culprit was the second prince's personal power. Of course, the great prince at the foot of Yin Mountain couldn't escape suspicion. At that moment, Fan Xian suddenly thought of something his father Count Sinan had said. When you don't know who your enemy is, don't make random enemies. Even if you know who your enemy is, so what? If he found out that it was the second prince who did it, could he really kill his way into the manor? Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He knew that some things were better left unclarified. There's no need to ask. Fan Xian rubbed the space between his brows. It seemed he was a bit depressed there. Kill them all? Yes. His subordinates were all malicious spirits of the Overwatch Council, so they were not surprised by this bloody order. They calmly walked forward, pulled out the knives at their sides, and stabbed them into the waist of the 2 men. 2 spluttering sounds rang out, and the 2 men's feet kicked wildly. Their eyes rolled back and they died. Bury him properly, Fan Xian ordered. He didn't put on any pretentious expression of sorrow. Yes, the subordinate replied. After leaving the courtyard, they walked through the small alleys of the capital for a long time before they stepped onto the main road. Wang Qinian accompanied him for a walk, maintaining the silence and courtesy that a subordinate should have. Fan Xian suddenly said, "When will the envoys from northern Qi and Dongyi arrive? The council should have this information." Wang Qinian replied, "From the moment they entered the country, the 4th Bureau has been assisting the local authorities in receiving them. Judging by the date, they should arrive at the beginning of next month. Fan Xian nodded. Help me find out who they are. Also, he paused for a moment. If this doesn't count as breaking the rules, could I trouble the council to ask our spies in Northern Qi to bring back some information? It would be best if they could find out what the bottom line the Northern Qi envoys are negotiating with is. Wang Qinian had heard the Crown Prince's words earlier, so he knew that Master Fan was going to be the assistant envoy. He spoke in a low voice. Yan Bingyun, the son of the head of the 4th Bureau Yan Ruahai, has been lurking in Northern Qi for 4 years. He's had some success, so I reckon he should have some good information. Fan Xian reminded him, don't talk about this kind of thing too much in the future. If Northern Qi found out, I'm afraid Master Yan's son would be in danger. Wang Qinian smiled. Master, as the commissioner, you have the authority to know about this. Fan Xian also smiled. It's better to know less about this kind of thing that involves taking responsibility. Wang Qinian looked at the gentle smile on Fan Xian's handsome face and thought of the murders in the council. He couldn't help but feel a little strange. If it's better not to know, then why do you still need to investigate? The deaths of those 2 men don't seem necessary. Fan Xian calmly replied, although it's better not to know, we still need to investigate. Those 2 men must die. Because I have to let others know that I know what they don't want me to know. The 2 lives are a warning to them not to try to manipulate me again. It seems that Nyolan Street didn't make those high and mighty people behave themselves. The death of my brother-in-law at the foot of the Tsang Mountains was caused by Sigu Jian. Perhaps they think I'm easy to bully? Although the series of no was a bit of a tongue twister, and Wang Qinian was a bit confused, he gradually understood the meaning and nodded. Fan Xian suddenly smiled. Don't worry. I've never seen blood or dead people. You don't know how I grew up. In the days that followed, the world was peaceful. The deaths of the 2 nameless men didn't seem to matter. But Fan Xian was sure that this matter had already begun to take effect. Occasionally he would go to Taichung Temple to do his morning roll. Occasionally he would go to Dambua bookstore to collect money. Occasionally he would go to the tofu shop to work. Occasionally he would go to the Prime Minister's manor to get closer to his future father-in-law. Occasionally he would sneak into the royal courtyard to fall in love. Occasionally he would stay at Fan Manor to tell his sister stories and copy books. That night, he washed up and prepared to go to bed. His gaze fell on the black leather suitcase that had been carelessly tossed to the side. He didn't know what was in the suitcase, so he was naturally curious. But after staying in the same room for so long and not knowing where the key went, he couldn't help but feel a bit numb. Of course, if he knew that Qin Pingping also cared about the suitcase, he would certainly reevaluate its value. He wouldn't just toss it in the room like trash. Instead, he would dig a large hole under the bed and cover it with 3 layers of steel. Where was the key? It was as if God had suddenly heard the greatest question in his heart. A cold voice rang out in Fan Xian's ear. The key is in the palace. Then, without any wind, a black stick came from the heavens and smashed viciously into Fan Xian's back. There was a muffled sound. Fan Xian couldn't dodge in time, and was heavily knocked to the ground. His back hurt and he coughed in pain, blowing a few strands of dust from his face. You've regressed. Although Wu Zhu's voice was emotionless, it was clear that he held a rather negative attitude towards Fan Xian's performance. Uncle? Fan Xian had grown accustomed to this kind of life. With great difficulty he crawled up from the ground. He slowly circulated the Jinqi in his body, alleviating the pain in his back. Looking at the dark corner of the wall, he couldn't help but whisper, Uncle, I haven't seen you for so many days. I've been worried to death. Wu Zhu was not used to the passion in his words. He coldly took half a step back and coldly cut through Fan Xian's lies. I know. You're not worried about me. Fan Xian smiled somewhat bitterly. He really wasn't worried. Wu Zhu was a perverted grandmaster assassin. He believed that no matter where he went he would be fine. But Fan Xian hadn't seen him for a long time and he really did miss him. He was curious as to what he had been up to. Perhaps Uncle Wu Zhu had always been by his side and he didn't know? Wu Zhu continued, the key is in the palace. The second repetition brought Fan Xian back to his senses. He frowned slightly and then suddenly understood. So you've been looking for the key all this time. This is the lady's relic. I shouldn't have listened to Qin Pingping and left the key in the capital. Wu Zhu's tone was still indifferent. I've been looking in the palace for a few days, and I've come up with 3 possible places. Too risky. Fan Xian growled in a low voice. Deep in his heart he was a little angry. Although Wu Zhu had the power of a grandmaster, the palace was no place to be trifled with. The guards were all experts, and Fei Jia had once mentioned that the most mysterious of the 4 grandmasters had always been hidden within the palace. Wu Zhu had risked staying in the palace for so many days. If he had been discovered, the mysterious grandmaster would have acted. With the addition of 500 armed guards, even if Wu Zhu's skills were divine, he wouldn't have been able to come out alive. As if he hadn't noticed Fan Xian's anger, Wu Zhu continued to speak. "Do you want the key?" Fan Xian calmed down. He understood why Wu Zhu had come today. Wu Zhu had always been a person who hid in the dark. If there wasn't something they needed to talk about, Fan Xian suspected that Wu Zhu would never see him again, and would only protect him from the shadows. And tonight, Wu Zhu had come to ask for the key, not to ask for Fan Xian's opinion, but because this matter required his participation. But, if it was difficult for Wu Zhu to take something from this world, what could Fan Xian help him with? As Fan Xian thought about it, he said quietly, "What do you need me to do?" "There are 3 places in the palace that are difficult to enter," Wu Zhu said expressionlessly. Fan Xian was curious about which 3 places they were and asked. "Xingqing Palace, Hongguang Palace and Guangxin Palace." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. Within the palace, these 3 places were the most heavily guarded. They were the residences of the emperor, the empress dowager, and the eldest princess. Not only were they the most difficult places to enter in the palace, but they were also the most difficult places in the world. "I want you to think of a way to get the eunuch Hong Xixiang out of the palace for 2 hours. Fan Xian frowned slightly. "Eunuch Hong? The head of the palace eunuchs, a senior statesman of 3 dynasties. I heard that he has been in the palace since the founding of the nation, and has great power. But if you want to steal the key from the palace, why do you want me to trick him out of the palace? What does this have to do with anything?" He suddenly understood something and raised his head in surprise to look at the black cloth on Wu Zhu's face. With a trembling voice, he said, "Could it be that Eunuch Hong is the most mysterious grandmaster in the legends?" Fei Jia had once said that of the 4 great grandmasters, one was Sigu Jian of Dongyi City, another was Ku He, the imperial advisor of northern Qi, and another was Yi Luyun of the kingdom of Qin. The last one was also from the kingdom of Qin, but no one knew who he was. Even with the power of the Overwatch Council, they could only vaguely sense that this great grandmaster was hiding in the royal palace of the kingdom of Qin. Wu Zhu shook his head. "I don't know. I haven't fought him, but I do know that in the palace, the one who can most easily find me is the eunuch Hong Xixiang." Fan Xian nodded. In his mind, given Wu Zhu's cautiousness, this old eunuch Hong must be an unfathomable figure in the palace. If even Wu Zhu was afraid of him, then perhaps eunuch Hong's identity as a grandmaster was already on the verge of being revealed. Given Wu Zhu's cold temperament, he could even kill Yi Luyun, but he couldn't kill him. Naturally, he wouldn't fear any grandmaster in the world. Last time, he had attacked violently to hide his relationship with Fan Xian. This time, however, he was trying to steal the key, so his style was somewhat different. Fan Xian thought about his recent arrangements, connecting the matter of envoys from northern Qi and Dongyi, but he still couldn't think of a good way to establish a relationship with the head eunuch in the palace. It was also not convenient to ask his father for help, otherwise he would have to explain many things that he didn't want to explain. Suddenly his eyes brightened. Wan should know about the palace. She lived in the palace until the beginning of this year, and only moved out at the beginning of this year. Tomorrow I'll go see her. Wu Zhu looked at him non-committally and said coldly, "I only want you to drag Hong Xixiang out of the palace for 2 hours. As for how you do it, that's your business." Fan Xian shrugged. "Uncle, you always give me the most difficult tasks." This was a naughty joke, and he hadn't talked to Wu Zhu for a while, so he seemed to have forgotten that Wu Zhu didn't have much of a sense of humor. Wu Zhu said seriously, "Then I'll go kill Hong Xixiang. Whether I succeed or not, I can probably stall him for 6 hours. You go to the palace and find the key." Fan Xian found that he had picked up a hot meteorite and smashed it on his foot. He quickly said with the utmost respect, "It's just to steal something. It's not too risky to challenge Hong Xixiang. I'll try to get in touch with him." After Wu Zhu left, Fan Xian remembered that he couldn't find him. If he did arrange everything in the future, how would he inform this blind uncle? Lying back on the bed, he looked at the black suitcase in a different way. If the key had to be placed in the most heavily guarded place in the palace, then there must be something very important or terrifying hidden inside the suitcase. For example, a map of the border, a list of high-ranking spies in the Overwatch Council that his mother had created, or a map of the Yi family's treasure? Fan Xian could no longer sleep peacefully. He stood up and kicked the suitcase under the bed as if he felt that it would be much safer this way. Fan Xian calmly went to Ruoruo's room and asked her for some needles for sewing. Ruoruo couldn't dissuade him, so she took out a few small needles from the box and handed them to him. She was curious. Looking into her brother's eyes, she asked, "This is for embroidery. Is your clothes torn? You can give it to the servant girl." Fan Xian smiled. "It's much more complicated than sewing clothes." He thought for a moment, then said, "Don't let anyone know that I took 3 needles from you." Fan Ruoruo nodded, confused. The wedding was imminent, and Fan Manor had already begun preparations. There was something strange about Fan Xian and Lin Wanner's marriage, so all the rules had to be re-established. At least it wouldn't be like other consorts, where the royal family arranged the prince consort's mansion. After all, Lin Wanner's status as a princess had always been limited to the palace. If it were to be done in the capital, it would probably give rise to rumors. The newly married mansion was next to Count Sinan's. It was just an empty garden, but Fan Xian had begun preparations for it at the beginning of the year, so it had long since been taken care of in splendor. There was a door in the back garden of the 2 courtyards, so the front and back manors were connected. The main entrance to Fan Xian's courtyard was on the opposite side of the street. It had been very quiet in the past few days. The workers had stopped working long ago, and the trees and rockery had long been taken care of. They were nourished by the wind and water. Because there weren't many people around, the large courtyard seemed very quiet. No one wanted to stay there for long. A black shadow floated by. It was Fan Xian. He had quietly come to the courtyard, holding a piece of tofu in his right hand and 3 silver needles between the 4 fingers of his left hand. He found a secluded place and carefully placed the tofu cubes between the branches of the willow tree. The tofu had become extremely tender after he had improved it, so it was placed there trembling as if it could break at any time. Fan Xian closed his eyes and slowly increased the tyrannical Jinqi in his dantian. It flowed through the top of his head and into the snow mountain behind his waist, forming 2 Jinqi channels, one large and one small. He allowed his entire body to enter a state of tranquility, without a single stray thought. The wind rose and Fan Xian's entire body became a gust of wind, blowing toward the center of the willow tree. With a light touch, the tips of his feet valiantly stopped his forward fall, and with a sudden sound, he used his control of his body to bounce back. It was like a crafty fish playing with a fool's hook. After a while, he slowly walked forward with his hands behind his back, squinting at the piece of tofu in the willow tree branch. There were 3 thin needles on the tofu and they were trembling slightly. In that split second, he had inserted the needles into the tofu with incredible speed and arranged them in the shape of a triangle. Based on Fan Xian's understanding of the human body, if this technique was used to kill someone, it would certainly be very effective. He retrieved the needles with satisfaction. Ever since Nyolan Street, he had been searching for a weapon that suited him best. Wu Zhu's weapon was a stick-shaped object. Whether it was a wooden stick or a simple iron drill in Wu Zhu's hands, it was a deadly weapon. This was the result of his realm. Fan Xian knew very well that for him, a handy weapon could save his life many times. In fact, he very much liked the slender dagger in his boot. Whether it was in Danzhou or Nyolan Street, the sharp dagger that Fei Jie had left behind had already helped him twice. However, this dagger could not be brought into certain places such as the royal palace. And Fan Xian knew that since the key was in the royal palace, he was afraid that, in the end, he would have to be like the swordsman in the novels of his previous life, and break through the forbidden area. Wu Zhu's stick and words yesterday had stimulated him a little, and he had found some passion again. He looked at the 3 needles on his finger reflecting the light of the rising sun, and couldn't help but frown. What kind of poison should he apply to them? Once he had a goal, he did things with passion. So when Fan Xian passionately entered Lin Wanner's boudoir on a dark night, she couldn't help but be pleasantly surprised. After all, it hadn't been that long since their last outing. After a moment of intimacy, Fan Xian pretended to casually ask about matters in the royal palace. Lin Wanner had grown up in the royal palace and was quite familiar with its people. She wasn't curious why her fiancé was suddenly interested in this. She thought that Fan Xian was worried about the rules of entering the royal palace to pay his respects, so she comforted him. The concubines in the royal palace are all very good to me, and His Majesty doesn't like women, so it's not like the old emperor of Northern Qi who died a few years ago, who had an endless supply of beauties. Besides Her Majesty, there are also the great prince's mother, Ning the Talented, the second prince's mother, Lady Shu, the third prince's mother, Igui Pin, and a few other concubines. I don't think I need to pay my respects. Fan Xian thought that those concubines naturally wouldn't want to offend her mother, the eldest princess, who was deeply favored by the Empress Dowager and controlled the palace treasury. He shifted his body on the bed to make holding one more comfortable. "Why is the great prince's mother only a talented person?" he asked curiously. Lin Wan'er explained, "Ning the Talented is from Dongyi. She was captured by His Majesty on his first northern expedition. I heard that on the battlefield, His Majesty was injured, and Ning the Talented took care of him day and night. So His Majesty freed her from slavery, and she entered the royal palace, where she gave birth to the great prince. But after all, she wasn't a citizen of Qin, so even though she saved the emperor and gave birth to his eldest son, she still couldn't win the Empress Dowager's favor, so she couldn't be made empress. Besides, she was already an imperial concubine. But 10 years ago, something happened in the royal palace. His Majesty was furious and he stripped her of her position, demoting her to a talented person." Fan Xian was slightly startled, thinking that the struggles in the royal palace were as complicated as he had imagined. Lin Wan'er sighed and continued, "Fortunately, eldest brother's military exploits in the west are outstanding, so Ning the Talented is able to maintain her position in the royal palace. But now she seems to understand many things and is quite content in the royal palace. In fact, I used to often go to her royal palace to play, but I haven't gone as often in the past 2 years." Fan Xian asked about some of the secrets of the royal palace, and Lin Wan'er didn't hide anything from him. In the end, Fan Xian finally asked about the topic of the night. Very casually he said, "I hear that the head of the eunuchs, Eunuch Hong, is very powerful in the royal palace." "Yes." Lin Wan'er was not a little tiger that night, but a kitten. She snuggled in his arms and gently rubbed her face. "Eunuch Hong has been in the royal palace since the founding of the country. When the previous emperor was on the throne, he was trusted. Today he still maintains his position as the head of the eunuchs, but he is old and doesn't care much. He basically stays in the Empress Dowager's palace." "In the Empress Dowager's palace?" Fan Xian's heart suddenly surged with many dark historical memories. "What is it?" Lin Wan'er asked curiously, her 2 large eyes blinking. Fan Xian pinched the tip of her cold nose and smiled. "It's nothing. It's just that if I want to have a good relationship with the royal palace, I have to do something about Eunuch Hong." "That won't be necessary," Lin Wan'er explained. "This old eunuch only walks around the royal palace. He doesn't care much." Fan Xian couldn't tell the woman in his arms about his plans, so he could only smile. "Leave a message for me to see when the royal palace will summon me." Lin Wan'er was embarrassed, but she didn't forget to tease him. "I think it'll be a few days." "What? Are you in a hurry?" "Of course I'm in a hurry. With such a good daughter-in-law outside, who wouldn't be in a hurry?" Gradually, the second floor of the building in the royal palace returned to silence. Looking at his fiancée sleeping soundly in his arms, Fan Xian unconsciously sighed. There were always many other things in life and he hoped he could handle them well. The next day when he went to Taichung Temple for morning attendance, Ren Shaoqing mysteriously pulled him to one side and lowered his voice. "Do you know about that matter?" Fan Xian looked at the man's 30 or 40-year-old face, which still had traces of the handsomeness of the past, and played dumb. "What matter?" Ren Shaoqing sighed. "The office of the Grand Herald sent a message this morning, saying that they want to transfer you over there." The office of the Grand Herald was responsible for receiving foreign guests and handling matters between countries. Fan Xian was startled. He knew that the matter the Crown Prince was talking about had begun. He cupped his hands and asked, "Sir, why do you want me to be transferred over there? I've only been at Taichung Temple for a dozen days." Ren Shaoqing frowned. "Does Sir Fan have any connections in the Eastern Palace?" Fan Xian knew that he was asking about his father. He shook his head. "You know that my father rarely interacts with the palace, not even with the ministers." "That's true." Vice Minister Ren nodded. Count Sinan was famous for his stubbornness. Taking advantage of the special relationship he had with the emperor, he didn't even pay attention to the prime minister in the past, and was always on equal footing with the other princes. Ren Shaoqing thought for a moment. "I heard that the Eastern Palace suggested that you participate in this negotiation." Fan Xian didn't know how to respond, so he continued to play dumb. "What negotiation?" "The envoy from Northern Qi is here to discuss the aftermath of the war between the vassal states of the northern frontier, such as the payment of money. The envoy from Dongyi is here to deal with the assassination attempt on the second son of the prime minister at the foot of the Tsang Mountains. I heard that he brought a lot of money and beautiful women." The so-called negotiation is to see how the imperial court haggles with these two places. Ren Xiao and was the prime minister's disciple, so he naturally saw Fan Xian as one of his own. He cautiously reminded him. If this matter is handled well, it will only be the icing on the cake. In any case, the soldiers have sacrificed their lives to conquer those territories. But if it is not handled well and we don't get the benefits that the emperor expects, then it will be very inappropriate. As for Dongyi, this matter involves the death of the second son. If you are too weak, it will be difficult to explain yourself to the prime minister. But since the imperial court has allowed the Dongyi envoy to come, it proves that the imperial court doesn't want to pursue this matter too much. They only want to get some benefits. After all, Dongyi still has Sigujian. Fan Xian frowned. These matters were indeed complicated. Ren Xiao, and continued with concern. Your identity is special. You and the prime minister are about to become father and son-in-law. If you try to cater to the emperor's wishes, you will lose your father's wishes. So this is a very awkward situation. You must be careful. Fan Xian was startled. Only then did he realize the crux of the matter. He gratefully cupped his hands in salute. I am new to officialdom and I don't know the intricacies of this. But this matter is a bit complicated. I am only an 8th level functionary. Even if the office of the Herald of Ceremonies sends me to assist, I fear that my words will carry little weight. Ren Xiao, and shook his head and sighed. This time you are the deputy envoy. You are at the peak of the storm. Who knows how many eyes are watching you? Why are they watching me? Thinking this, Fan Xian smiled and said, You worry too much, sir. There should be no problem. Indeed, Ren Xiao, and had worried too much. Although he didn't know what the Eastern Palace meant by sending him to be the deputy envoy, whether it was to rope him in or to make him lose the emperor's wishes, Fan Xian had already made sufficient preparations. He was not afraid. In the afternoon, an official's sedan chair came to pick him up. It traveled along the bluestone path, and in less than a quarter of an hour, the sedan chair entered the office of the Herald of Ceremonies. The office of the Herald of Ceremonies was equivalent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of later generations. The Minister of the Office of the Herald of Ceremonies was equivalent to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. In his previous life, Fan Xian believed in a saying, a weak country has no diplomacy. Now that the Kingdom of Qing was the most powerful country in the world, the office of the Herald of Ceremonies had become a very lucrative and prestigious yamen. Surrounded by dense cypress trees, the summer heat could not penetrate the yamen at all. Fan Xian sat quietly in the quiet hall, listening to the man above him speak. The speaker was Xan Qiwu, the vice-envoy of the office of the Herald of Ceremonies. Northern Qi and Dongyi had come to deliver their letters of credence. To the officials of the Kingdom of Qing who were used to being the boss, this was not a very big deal. So the vice-envoy of the office of the Herald of Ceremonies was still sleeping at home. The person in charge of this matter was only a 4th-rank vice-envoy. Master Fan, this time the court appointed you as the deputy envoy. First, it is because of your talent, and second, the matter of Northern Qi has something to do with you. It is just that you are not familiar with these matters, so there is no need to rush. Take your time. Xan Qiwu knew that the beautiful young man sitting at the very bottom had a powerful background, so he spoke very politely. Yes. Master Fan, your poetry is famous throughout the capital. Coming to our office of the Herald of Ceremonies to reason with those foreigners is a waste of your talent. A large group of officials looked at Fan Xian, quietly flattering him. At the same time, they were afraid that this young master would steal all the credit from the office of the Herald of Ceremonies. They couldn't help but look a little embarrassed. Chapter 123. Fan Xian did not dare to be careless. He quickly stood up and bowed, then cupped his hands in salute. He looked at the diplomatic officials of the Kingdom of Qing with a warm expression and said sincerely, I have only been in Taichung Temple for a few days, and I do not even understand the music of the court. The palace appointed me as deputy, presumably to let the Northern Qi rebels see that the people of the Qing kingdom cannot be casually killed. They only want me to be a memorial. They don't actually want me to do anything during the negotiations. He chuckled and continued, I know nothing about the relations between nations. I only hope that I will not be a hindrance to you. I hope you will not hesitate to enlighten me. After all, he was not someone who had been in the bureaucracy for a long time. Fan Xian's words were a bit excessive and reckless. But this kind of straightforward speech actually made the officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies feel very comfortable. Originally, when they learned that Assistant Minister Fan's son was going to participate in the negotiations, these self-proclaimed professionals of the Kingdom of Qing always felt a little uncomfortable. It was like a group of carrion crows, and suddenly a vulture had flown in for a bone. Since Fan Xian had made it clear that he was not here to fight for credit, the people of Honglu Temple were naturally much happier. Xan Qiwu also nodded his head in approval. Of course, everyone knew that if they could successfully demarcate the border, they would be able to obtain a large amount of tribute silver and be rewarded accordingly. This nobleman, who was clearly here to gild his name, would certainly receive what he deserved. After the meeting, Xan Qiwu led Fan Xian to a small room that had been prepared for him. He pointed to a large cabinet filled with documents and said, "The relevant information is all here. The most important thing in this negotiation is that Northern Qi wants to give some silver in exchange for a large piece of land, which we have already occupied. Dongyi does not have any requests. They only want to settle the last 2 assassinations. The first is the Nyolan Street incident related to Fan Xian. The 2 female assassins have already been proven to be the disciples of Sigu Jian's second disciple. The second is the matter of the manor at the foot of Tsang Mountain, but..." He looked at Fan Xian and paused for a moment before continuing, "As you know, that matter is a bit complicated, so the court will not be able to come up with any good evidence." Fan Xian nodded. Smelling the stale air in the room, he began to feel a headache coming on. Would he have to deal with these things for the next few days? As if reading his mind, Vice-Chancellor Xen smiled and said, "If Master Fan does not wish to stay on duty, you may take it home with you. But you are not allowed to take a single step out of the yamen, as long as it is marked in red." Fan Xian was overjoyed. Although he knew that the old man did not want to see him as an eyesore, he still gratefully said, "To tell the truth, I have no idea why I came here today. If you do not mind my laziness, I am willing to sleep at home every day." For a mere 8th-level functionary to make such a joke with a 4th-level vice minister of Honglu Temple, Fan Xian reckoned he was a rare anomaly in the Qing kingdom. Xan Qiwu paused for a moment before bursting into laughter. He lowered his voice and said, "Master Fan, the Eastern Palace has high hopes for you." Fan Xian smiled. Now that he knew who Xan Qiwu was, he did not dare to be vague. He quickly replied, "Please do not worry, sir. I understand. My father often teaches his sons that as an official, I must abide by the rules of an official." Hearing this reply, Xan Qiwu, who was the Crown Prince's confidant, nodded with satisfaction. "Count Sinan is devoted to the country. I have always admired him." The 2 of them exchanged a few more indifferent words before Vice-Chancellor Xan left. Fan Xian watched him leave and gradually narrowed his eyes. His father had indeed said that as long as the Crown Prince was on the throne, the Fan family would naturally be loyal to the Crown Prince. But even Fan Xian himself did not believe these words. Xan Qiwu, who was clearly a member of the Eastern Palace, would not believe it so easily. Appointing Fan Xian as deputy envoy was only a cautious attempt by the Eastern Palace to see if the Fan family could move a little closer to the Crown Prince's throne, even if it was just a little. In the following dozen days, Fan Xian did as he said. Every day he shut himself in the manor and slept. Of course, for him, sleeping itself was a necessary process of cultivation. As for the official matters, after he took back some information, he handed it over to Wang Qinian and let him make the decision to come up with a proper negotiation plan. Fan Xian knew very well that Wang Qinian would secretly report to the old cripple of the Overwatch Council. Since that was the case, he handed over this complicated and boring task to Wang Qinian. Whether it was for the sake of his mother or his father, Qin Pingping could not allow Fan Xian to lose face in court. Of course he would handle it appropriately. When it came to using resources that he could use, he did not hold back. As expected, a few days later, Wang Qinian came to the small room they had agreed upon, looking haggard. He handed over a thick folder. Fan Xian curiously opened it and his eyes lit up. He saw that it was divided into 2 parts. One was the internal reference material that only the high-ranking officials of the Office of the Grand Herald were allowed to see, and the other was the prepared file on the negotiations with Northern Qi. The material clearly analyzed the internal situation of Northern Qi, including the scheming between the young emperor and the Empress Dowager, Imperial Advisor Ku He being a pacifist, and so on. The material clearly stated that the Empress Dowager's younger brother, the Marquis of Ning, had been attacked by the civil officials of Northern Qi because of his defeat. Thus, the young emperor did not care how much money he had to pay or how much land he had to cut off. As long as the people were angry, he could use this opportunity to weaken the power of the Empress Dowager. Because the Empress Dowager was anxious to calm things down and free up her hands to reorganize the court, her instructions for this negotiation were mainly to be patient. Of course, these things hidden in the dark could not be seen by the foreign officials of the Qing kingdom. Only the secret power of the Overwatch Council, through spies all over northern Qi, could find out every little thing, and then put them together and analyze them, could come to such a clear conclusion. Wonderful. Fan Xian sighed. With this information in hand, the officials of the office of the Grand Herald will be laughing their heads off. He paused, then asked curiously, how reliable is this information? The corners of Wang Qinyan's eyes drooped. It seemed that he had not slept well for the past few days. Very reliable. Yan Bingyun has already made a name for himself in northern Qi, and the entire intelligence network is very reasonable. With mutual reference there should be no problem. Fan Xian could not help but feel some respect for the young man called Yan Bingyun. For the sake of the country, he was content to be a rat in the shadows, and he had done so for many years. As the son of a high-ranking official in the court, it was not easy. How could he know that the reason Yan Bingyun was pitifully staying in northern Qi was because of the attempted assassination when Fan Xian was 12 years old? If Fan Xian knew about this, he did not know whether he would feel guilty or laugh out loud. Wang Qinian, I didn't expect you to be so good at intelligence analysis as well as tracking. Fan Xian knew exactly where this dossier had come from, but he did not point it out. Wang Qinian could only return the courtesy, not daring to claim credit. Fine, I'll go to the office of the Grand Herald tomorrow and discuss this with the Vice Minister. Fan Xian saw that Wang Qinian seemed to want to say something and asked curiously, is there anything else? Wang Qinian said awkwardly, Sir, this information cannot be given to the office of the Grand Herald. What? Because the secrets involved are of the highest level. The entire office of the Grand Herald, including the Minister of the Grand Herald, has no right to access them. Fan Xian slapped his forehead and laughed bitterly. Then what do you think we should do? Let the council go through normal channels and give it directly to the office of the Grand Herald. Wang Qinian sighed. If it were not for the fact that the director wanted Fan Xian to astonish everyone in the negotiations and pave the way for his future career, he would not have ordered the entire 6th Bureau to work through the night to write this dossier. This dossier looked ordinary, but it contained the blood, sweat and tears of the Overwatch Council's intelligence analysts. If Fan Xian were to simply give it to the office of the Grand Herald, the director would probably jump out of his wheelchair in anger. It was the end of summer and the heat was still hot. The people on the streets of the capital and the black dogs on the streets were somewhat dispirited by the weather. On the 8th day of the 8th month, an auspicious day, the northern Qi and Dongyi envoys arrived at the last official resting place to the northwest of the capital. The Emperor of the Kingdom of Qing had personally issued an edict allowing the two envoys to stay in the Emperor's palace. The protocol officials of the three sides argued for a few days, and finally decided on a schedule and arrangements for their arrival in the capital. The people of the capital were all roused. They felt that in their ordinary and boring lives, there had suddenly been an autumn rain. In their minds, the envoys of these two countries were not here to negotiate, but to present their letters of surrender. As the deputy envoy for negotiations, Fan Xian was naturally part of the group that welcomed the envoys. From the west gate of the capital, he waited for the officials of the two countries, and arranged for them to stay in the official resting place. The faces of the northern Qi envoys were clearly unsightly. After all, they had been the losers in this battle of commanding the vassal states. Furthermore, many of their soldiers had been captured and most importantly, a lot of their land had been occupied. Sir, who is this? The highest-ranking official in the northern Qi envoys was the younger brother of the current empress, Chang Ningho. He looked down at the handsome young man from above, and his heart was filled with anger. The kingdom of Qing did not value him. The official receiving him was only a minor official from the office of the Grand Herald, and yet they had allowed such a young man to be the deputy envoy. It could not be helped that they were looking down on him. I am Fan Xian. Greetings, Master Marquis. Fan Xian's face was full of smiles as he looked at the enemy. The intelligence report from the Overwatch Council in his bosom made it clear that this man was just a decoration. The man in the sedan behind him, Zhuang Mohan, was the real deal. He had been arranged by the palace to live in a side courtyard. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.